Marjorie Wexler slid the check across the polished conference table like she was tipping a valet. "Take it," she said, "and disappear." Zuri Bennett stared at those 7 zeros and felt something shift inside her chest, not greed, not gratitude. Something colder, something final. 5 years. 5 years of being watched at family dinners like she might steal the silverware. 5 years of Marjorie pronouncing her name just slightly wrong every single time, like the correction itself was beneath her. 5 years of building a life inside a house that never once felt like home. Zuri pushed the check back. The room went absolutely silent. "I don't want your money, Marjorie." Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised by that. "I want out." Marjorie's smile turned to porcelain, beautiful and breakable and sharp at the edges. "Then you'll leave with nothing." She had no idea how wrong she was. And she had no idea that someone, right now, was already watching someone who remembered a rainy night 3 years ago when a stranger knelt beside him in an alley and refused to walk away. If you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button and follow Zuri's story all the way to the end. I promise you will not see what's coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning of the divorce settlement, Zuri woke up at 4:43 and lay in the dark staring at a water stain on the ceiling of her rented room. She had moved out of the Wexler residence 6 weeks earlier with 2 suitcases, a carry-on, and her laptop. She had left behind the artwork she'd picked herself, the kitchen appliances she'd bought with her own salary, the small potted lemon tree she'd kept alive through 2 Korean winters. She left it all because fighting over objects would have meant staying longer inside, a space that was slowly hollowing her out from the inside. The rented room was on the 4th floor of a building in Mapo-gu, directly above a dry cleaner. The smell of chemical solvent crept through the floorboards after 6 p.m. The window faced a concrete wall. The radiator made a sound like someone tapping on pipes in Morse code, slowly, with no message that ever completed. Zuri told herself she was fine. She made coffee in a plastic kettle. She ironed the navy blazer she'd owned since before the marriage. She ate half a banana standing at the counter because sitting down to eat alone in a silent room still felt like something she had to work up to. Her phone buzzed. Her attorney, Min-ji Young, confirming the 10 o'clock start time and reminding her not to speak unless directly addressed. Zuri texted back a single thumbs up and finished the other half of the banana. She was not fine. She knew it. But she was upright and dressed and moving, and on mornings like this one, that counted as a victory. The conference room on the 31st floor of the Wexler Group's Seoul headquarters had a view of the Han River that probably cost more than Zuri's entire childhood neighborhood. She'd been inside this building dozens of times during the marriage. She'd attended corporate dinners here, holiday receptions, a quarterly board lunch where Marjorie had introduced her to a Japanese investor as Elliot's wife and immediately moved on, as though a name was unnecessary information. Today the room was arranged differently. 2 tables pushed together lengthwise. The Wexler legal team on one side, 4 attorneys, paralegal, 2 consultants Zuri didn't recognize. Elliot at the end, in a charcoal suit that probably cost $4,000, looking at his phone. He did not look up when she entered. Marjorie Wexler sat at the center of her team like a woman who had engineered this room's entire architecture. 71 years old, gray hair set with architectural precision, wearing a cream blazer and a string of pearls that were probably older than Zuri's mother. She looked at Zuri, the way you look at something you've been meaning to throw out but keep forgetting. "Zuri," she said, and dropped the first syllable so fast it barely existed. "Marjorie." Zuri sat down. She put her bag on the floor. She folded her hands on the table because she needed something to do with them. Min Ji-young sat beside her and arranged her folders with the efficient calm of someone who had done this 300 times. Probably had. Zuri was grateful for her steadiness in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The lead Wexler attorney Park. Something she could never remember laid out the settlement terms in the flat, airless language of someone reading a flight safety card. The offer was generous on paper, an apartment in Yongsan-gu. A monthly stipend for 5 years, a lump sum. Non-disclosure agreement. A clause restricting Zuri from making public statements about the Wexler family or their business interests for 7 years. Marjorie watched her the entire time. Zuri read every line. Min Ji-young had already walked her through it the previous afternoon. She knew exactly what she was declining and exactly why. When Park something finished, he slid the signature page toward her. Zuri looked at it. Then she looked at Marjorie. I'm not signing. The air shifted in the room. Park something blinked. One of the consultants wrote something down. Elliot finally looked up from his phone. Zuri. Min Ji-young's voice was carefully neutral. This is a significant, I'm not signing, Zuri said again. And she said it to Marjorie because Marjorie was the only person in the room who actually mattered. I don't want the apartment. I don't want the money. I don't want the enda. I want the marriage dissolved and my name back, and I want to walk out of here. Marjorie set down her water glass with a small, precise click. You're being emotional, probably, Zuri said, still not signing. Marjorie's expression didn't collapse. She was too controlled for that. But something behind her eyes recalibrated, like a machine registering an unexpected variable. She leaned forward slightly, just enough that only Zuri could hear the drop in her voice. You came here from nothing. You built nothing here that wasn't given to you by this family. If you walk out of this room without that settlement, I promise you, and I mean this, Zuri, I want you to hear me clearly, you will leave Korea with less than you brought. Zuri had rehearsed this moment in her head 17 times. In most of those rehearsals, she cried. In 2 of them, she yelled. In one particularly bad version at 3 in the morning, she said nothing and signed the paper. Instead, she stood up. Then I'll leave with nothing, she said. That's still more than what this marriage cost me. She picked up her bag. She nodded to Min Ji-young. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Marjorie say something in Korean, quiet and clipped, to the attorney beside her. She didn't look back. She made it to the elevator before her hands started shaking. She made it to the lobby before she sat down on a bench near the entrance and breathed in through her nose 4 counts, out through her mouth 4 counts, a sound like green wood splitting the way her therapist had shown her 18 months ago when the panic attacks started happening without warning. She sat there for 6 minutes. A security guard glanced at her. She smiled at him. He looked away. Then she stood up, walked through the revolving door, and stepped out into Seoul's gray November morning. She didn't know, standing there on the sidewalk, that Marjorie Wexler was already on the phone. She didn't know that by the following morning, the first story would be live. She didn't know any of it yet. She just stood on the sidewalk, breathing cold air and thinking that the worst was probably over. It wasn't close to over. The first article appeared on a mid-tier Korean entertainment and lifestyle site at 7:14 the following morning. Zuri's was still in bed when Min Ji-young called. Don't read it, Min Ji-young said, which was the single most guaranteed way to ensure Zuri would immediately read it. The headline translated roughly as, The Foreign Wife Who Married for the Wexler Fortune and Lost Her Bet. The article cited multiple sources close to the family. It described Zuri as calculating and socially ambitious, a woman who had targeted Elliot specifically because of his family's wealth and connections. It quoted without attribution someone who claimed to have known Zuri's real intentions from the beginning. It included a photograph from their honeymoon in Jeju. Zuri in a white dress on a beach at sunset. It was a good photograph. She remembered the moment it was taken. Elliot had been 2 drinks in and laughing at something a boat captain said, and she had turned toward him with actual happiness on her face. She stared at that face for a long time. Then she called Min Ji-young back. Who gave them the photo? We're looking at that, Min Ji-young said carefully. Min Ji-young, a pause. It came from within the Wexler organization. We're not certain of the level, but the photo was from a private family archive. Zuri put the phone down on the bed and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the lemon tree she'd left behind. She thought about whether anyone was watering it. Then she thought, they planned this. Not as a reaction to her walking out. This was prepared in advance. The articles, the photographs. The anonymous sources. Marjorie hadn't just made a promise in that conference room. She'd already built the machine to fulfill it. Zuri was still working out what that meant when her phone buzzed again. A sound like her boss at the cultural consulting firm where she worked part-time, the job she'd rebuilt for herself after leaving Wexler Group's communications department 2 years into the marriage, was calling to tell her that, given recent press coverage and the sensitivity of their client relationships, it might be better to take some time. He didn't use the word fired. He used administrative pause. Zuri sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her lap for a long time after that call ended. She thought about the banana she'd eaten standing up the morning before. She thought about how she'd told herself that was fine, that being upright was enough. She'd been wrong about the worst being over. She needed to stop making that mistake. Over the following 11 days, the story metastasized in the particular way that bad stories do when someone with resources is actively feeding them. New articles appeared, some in English, reaching expatriate communities. 3 of them included a photograph she had never seen before, pulled from a company directory during her brief time working in the Wexler Group's communications department, which made the corporate espionage angle easier to insinuate without stating directly. She lost the consulting work. She lost the freelance contract she'd been negotiating with a nonprofit in Taiwan. Her landlord, a man who had never once complained about her in 14 months, called to say that the building management had received inquiries about her tenancy and that he was very sorry, but the situation was creating discomfort. What kind of inquiries? Zuri asked. He couldn't say. He was sorry. He was very sorry. She had 30 days to vacate. She sat on the floor of her rented room above the dry cleaner and thought very carefully about what she had left. Savings, enough for 3 months, 4 if she was aggressive about it. Professional network, damaged, possibly terminally, in Seoul. She had contacts in New York and London, but she'd built her career here. 5 years of relationships and references, and most of them were attached in some way to Elliot's world. Family, her mother in Atlanta, who would fly to Korea tomorrow if Zuri asked, and who Zuri would not ask because her mother was 63 and had a bad hip and didn't need this. Legal options. Min Ji-young was still working, still sending letters, still filing defamation inquiries. But the Wexlers had attorneys in 3 countries. The financial asymmetry was not subtle. Then the corporate espionage story broke. Not insinuated. Not implied. A full article with documents she had never seen before in her life, purportedly showing that she had accessed proprietary acquisition data during her time inside the Wexler Group and passed it to an unnamed competitor. The documents looked real. That was the frightening part. Not plausible real, or almost real. They looked real in the way that expensive fabrications do, built from enough actual infrastructure that the fakes blend in. Min Ji-young called within an hour. Her voice was different this time. Tighter, Zuri. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I've never seen those documents before. Okay. I wouldn't even know how to access that level of financial data. I was in communications. I wrote internal newsletters and coordinated press releases. I believe you, Min Ji-young said, but someone went to considerable trouble to make it look otherwise. This level of document fabrication, this isn't someone's personal grudge. This requires resources. Zuri already knew that. What she didn't know was why. The settlement she'd refused was substantial, but the Wexlers had resources that made it effectively immaterial. Destroying her, this completely burning through lawyers and PR operatives and document fabricators, made no financial sense unless there was something else underneath it. She just couldn't see what it was yet. She was in her now nearly empty room, surrounded by the boxes she'd begun packing, when the first anonymous message arrived. Not an email. An envelope slid under her door. She found it at 11:17 at night when she got up for water. Inside, a single piece of paper. Printed text, no signature, no return information. You worked there. Think about what you saw. Not what they told you was unimportant. She read it 4 times. Then she put it in the inner pocket of her blazer and lay back on her sleeping bag. The bed had gone, with the furniture she couldn't afford to store, and stared up at the water stain. She thought about 18 months inside the Wexler Group's communications department, writing newsletters, coordinating press, sitting in meetings where she was the only person in the room who wasn't already rich. She thought about files, emails, documents she'd been CC'd on accidentally. Period where the inbox routing had been misconfigured and senior-level communications had ended up in the wrong department for 3 weeks before anyone caught it. She'd flagged it. She'd flagged it to her supervisor and been told not to worry about it, that it was being corrected, that she shouldn't mention it to anyone because it was embarrassing. She'd forgotten about it, or she'd thought she'd forgotten. Now, lying on a sleeping bag in a room above a dry cleaner, with 30 days to leave, she started to remember. She fell asleep just before 3 a.m., still thinking. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse above the Gangnam district, with a view that reached to the mountains, a man who had not slept well in years was reading a summary document prepared by his intelligence team. He read the same 4 lines 3 times. Subject has lost employment. Subject has lost housing. Criminal allegations expected within weeks. Financial resources depleting. He put the document down. He stood at his window. He was 39 years old. And he had spent the last 15 years building something enormous and merciless and efficient, and he was not accustomed to the sensation currently moving through him. It wasn't unfamiliar, exactly. He recognized it from a very specific night, in a specific alley, when he'd been conscious enough to see a woman he'd never met kneel down in the rain beside him and press 2 fingers to his wrist to check his pulse. He remembered thinking, she's going to leave. Everyone left. That was the architecture of his entire world. Everyone left, or was paid to stay, or was afraid to go. She hadn't left. She'd stayed until the ambulance arrived. She'd ridden with him to the hospital. She'd stood at the admissions desk and given them her credit card for the emergency deposit. A woman who didn't know his name, or what he did, or why he was bleeding in an alley at midnight. He had rebuilt himself from that night physically, and in some way he'd never fully articulated otherwise. He had found out who she was. He had kept track from a careful distance for 3 years. He had told himself it was gratitude. He was no longer certain that was all it was. He picked up his phone and called a number that rang 3 times before a voice answered. She needs better legal representation, he said, not obviously connected to me. And I want full monitoring on everything. The Wexler organization is deploying journalists, operatives every channel. Yes, the voice said. He hung up. He stood at the window a little longer. Then he went back to the document. Criminal allegations expected within weeks. He thought about a woman in a rain-soaked alley, checking his pulse. Not if I get there first, he said to no one, in the dark. She found the second envelope 4 days later, not slipped under her door this time. This one was tucked inside the frame of the building's front entrance, folded small, her name written in block letters with no surname. She almost missed it. She was carrying 2 grocery bags and watching the pavement because the tiles near the entrance were uneven, and she'd caught her heel twice. She stopped walking. She set the bags down. She opened it. Orexis Pharmaceuticals. Find the acquisition date. Find what was approved 2 weeks before regulations changed. She stood in the doorway reading until the dry cleaner owner appeared behind her and said something politely inquiring. She stepped aside, shoved the note into her coat pocket, and climbed the stairs to her floor. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall because she didn't have a chair anymore. She ate rice crackers from one of the grocery bags and opened her laptop. Orexis Pharmaceuticals. The first search returned mostly financial news. A mid-sized Korean-American pharmaceutical company, majority of operations based in Incheon, some facilities in New Jersey. Acquired 18 months ago by Wexler Group's subsidiary investment arm. The deal had been covered in 2 business publications and a trade journal, language uniformly neutral, nothing remarkable on the surface. She dug further. The regulatory angle took 40 minutes to find because she didn't know exactly what she was looking for. But the note said to find what changed, and when, so she started building a timeline. The Orexis acquisition was finalized on March 14th. She found a government health ministry bulletin, buried in a secondary document archive. announcing new pharmaceutical acquisition compliance standards that would have required additional environmental review and independent safety audits for any acquisition of a company with Orekisex's profile. The bulletin was dated March 28th, 2 weeks after the Orekis deal closed. Zuri sat very still for a moment. She thought about the misconfigured inbox. The 3 weeks where senior-level communications had ended up in the wrong department. She'd been in the Wexler Group Communications Division from January through August of that year. March would have been inside that window. She closed her laptop. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eye sockets until she saw red. She had seen something. She hadn't known she was seeing it. But someone who knew what had moved through that inbox understood exactly what she might be sitting on. They had decided that the cleanest solution was to make her so completely discredited that nothing she ever said would survive contact with the public. They weren't trying to punish her for the divorce. They were trying to bury her before she could understand what she already knew. She picked up her phone and called Min Ji-young. "I need to talk to you." Not over the phone. Min Ji-young's pause was very brief. "My office. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Thank you." She sat in the dark for another hour. She didn't turn the lights on. She found in some strange way that darkness was easier right now than the particular quality of light her single remaining lamp produced. Then she got up, made tea, and started writing down everything she could remember from those 3 weeks in March. Min Ji-young's office was on the 12th floor of a building in Seocho-gu, modest for the district, with a window overlooking a parking structure that offered zero scenic value. This was one of the things Zuri genuinely liked about her. The office didn't perform its own importance. Zuri arrived at 7:53. The attorney was already at her desk. She listened to everything without interrupting. She made no notes. When Zuri finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You're telling me you may have received documents during the acquisition period." "I'm telling you I'm certain I received something. I don't remember specifics. I flagged the inbox error and was told to forget it." "Who told you?" "My department supervisor at the time. Han something, I can't remember his surname. He left Wexler Group about a year after I did." Min Ji-young pulled a notepad toward her. "First name?" "Sungjae, maybe. I'm not certain." Zuri leaned forward. "Min Ji-young, if this is why they're doing this, if the whole campaign is because I accidentally received those files 3 years ago, then it changes everything about how we defend you," Min Ji-young said. "Because it means the defamation isn't opportunistic. It's preemptive." She tapped the notepad with her pen. "Which also means the criminal case they're building against you isn't about punishing you for the divorce. It's to neutralize you before you piece this together." "I've already pieced it together, Zuri." Min Ji-young looked at her steadily. "You've pieced together a theory. A theory you can't prove yet, sourced from anonymous notes you can't attribute, built on a document routing error that happened 3 years ago that you flagged and were told to ignore. Against 4 lawyers, a PR operation, and political connections we haven't fully mapped yet. So what do I do? You need better resources than I can provide alone." She said it plainly, without apology. "I've been filing defamation inquiries into a wall. I have access to legal databases and a small research team. What you're describing, if you're right, requires forensic financial investigation, media network analysis, political exposure. I'm not equipped for that alone. I can't afford. Your current legal fees are being covered by a third-party trust." Min Ji-young said it carefully, watching Zuri's face. "I should have told you sooner. I was instructed not to until you asked directly." Zuri went very still. "What trust? It's structured to be anonymous. I genuinely don't know who funded it. I know it's legitimate. I verified the originating bank and the registration. But I cannot identify the individual behind it." The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere below, a car alarm sounded and stopped. "Someone's been paying for my legal defense without telling me." "Yes. For how long?" "Since 4 days after your divorce settlement meeting." Zuri thought about that. The timing was too precise. The day after Marjorie's promise. Whoever this was had moved fast, and they had moved before the smear campaign even launched publicly. You said you can't identify them. Not through the trust structure. Min Ji-young set down her pen. But whoever they have access to sophisticated financial instruments. They moved quickly, and they chose not to be seen. That's not a charitable impulse. That's a specific, intentional decision. Zuri stared at the surface of the desk for a moment. Do you trust the money? I trust that it's real and that it comes with no stated conditions. A pause. Whether you trust it is your decision. Zuri picked up her bag. She stood. She thought about anonymous envelopes and a note with her name in block letters and a pharmaceutical acquisition date and 2 weeks that changed everything. Keep working, she said. I'll figure out the rest. The Korean-American Cultural Exchange Networking event was held on the 14th floor of a hotel in Mapogu on a Thursday evening in December, and Zuri almost didn't go. She'd received the invitation 2 weeks earlier, through a professional listserv she'd forgotten she subscribed to. The event was genuinely within her previous professional sphere, cultural exchange organizations, NGO workers, bilingual professionals, academics. Before the scandal, she would have attended without thinking about it. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror for 12 minutes, deciding whether she was brave enough to walk into a room full of people who had probably seen her name attached to words like manipulation and espionage and gold digger. She went because staying in the room was becoming a different kind of damage. She wore the navy blazer. She took the subway. She arrived 7 minutes after the official start time because arriving exactly on time felt like trying too hard, and arriving late felt like giving up. The room was what she expected: name tags, catered cocktails, clusters of people performing casual networking with varying degrees of authenticity. Several people recognized her. She saw it in the specific way they recalibrated their faces, the small reset of expression that happened when someone decided, in real time, how to arrange themselves around an uncomfortable social variable. 2 women she'd met at a previous event turned slightly away when she moved in their direction. Not dramatically, just enough. A man she'd worked with briefly at a cultural consulting project the previous year crossed the room to say hello, and then ran out of things to say within 90 seconds and excused himself. She got a glass of water. She stood near the window. She thought about leaving. That's an interesting expression. The voice came from beside her, not behind, not an approach, just a man already occupying the same window adjacency who had apparently been there long enough to observe something about her face. She looked at him. He was perhaps 40, Korean, plainly dressed in a dark suit with no tie. No name tag, she noticed that immediately. Average height, compact build, the kind of stillness that some people wore as a natural thing and other people had to work at. His face was angular, a scar she couldn't quite track, running somewhere behind his jaw. He was looking out the window when she looked at him, not at her, which meant she could look at him for a moment without it being a thing. Expression, she said, like you're calculating exit routes while trying to look like you're not. Considered that. Most people in this room would pretend they don't recognize me. I know who you are. He said it without inflection, no judgment attached to it, which was different from the polite distance version of recognition she'd been fielding all evening. The stories had been running for 3 weeks. And he looked at her then. His eyes were dark and very direct. And nothing. People believe what they're given to believe until they have a reason to reconsider. Most of them, a slight inclination of his head toward the room, don't have a reason yet. You do? I'm not much of a newspaper reader, he said. I find the sourcing unreliable. She almost smiled, which surprised her. That's a diplomatic way to say you don't believe it. I didn't say that either. He looked back at the window. I said I find the sourcing unreliable. What I believe is a different question, and I don't have enough information to answer it. Zuri turned to face the window as well. Below, the street moved in its ordinary patterns, taxis and pedestrians, and a delivery bike weaving through everything. Most people, she said quietly, are not that careful about the distinction. Most people aren't paying close attention. She turned her water glass in her hands. You're not wearing a name tag. No. That's either confidence or an oversight. One of those, yes. He glanced at her, and there was something briefly behind his eyes that was there, and then gone. like a word crossed out before it could be read. She waited for him to introduce himself. He didn't. "Are you going to tell me your name?" she asked. "If you ask me to." "I'm asking." "Kang Do-hwan," he said. The name meant nothing to her. She stored it anyway, the way she'd started storing everything recently carefully, in case it mattered later. "Zuri Bennett," she said. "I know. No performance to it, just acknowledgement." They stood at the window for a while, and for the first time in weeks, nobody in her immediate vicinity was performing anything. He wasn't performing comfort. He wasn't performing the careful distance. He was just standing there, looking at the street, occasionally saying something low and dry about a passing conversation they could both half hear from the room behind them. She stayed at the event another hour because of that window. When she left, he was still there. She thought about him on the subway home. She thought about how he hadn't once adjusted his behavior based on her public situation, hadn't offered sympathy or performative neutrality. He'd treated her like a person who didn't require special handling. She hadn't realized how hungry she was for that until it happened. 3 days later, she found out who he was. She found it entirely by accident. Looking up something else, a Korean language business article about real estate development in the Gangnam district referenced Kang Do-hwan as a well-known figure in Seoul's private construction and logistics sector, and the next result in the search returned an English-language organized crime watchdog document that listed him as a significant person of interest in connection with Seoul's underground financial networks. She read that document for a long time. Then she searched further. The picture that assembled itself from different sources, some legitimate, some not, was large and not clean, and did not fit at all with the quiet man at the window who had talked to her like she was a real person. Kang Do-hwan, 39, publicly founder and chairman of KD Holdings, a legitimate conglomerate spanning security services, logistics, commercial real estate, and construction. Privately, according to sources that varied in their reliability, but were consistent enough to some in their overall architecture, to some considerably more than that. Networks of influence, financial conduits, connections into organized crime structures that Seoul's authorities had spent years trying to map and never fully managed to. A man who had not needed a name tag because everyone who needed to know him already did. She sat with this for a full day before she did anything. She thought about the anonymous legal fund. She thought about the timing. She thought about the envelopes under her door and in the building entrance, the block letter handwriting, the precision of what they directed her toward. She called Min Ji-young, the trust, the anonymous legal fund. "Can you trace anything beyond the bank?" "I've tried," Min Ji-young said. "The structure is specifically designed to prevent backward tracing. Whoever set it up knew exactly how to do it. Does the originating bank have any known associations with KD Holdings?" Pause, longer than the usual ones. "Why are you asking about KD Holdings?" "Because I need to know." Another pause. "There are historical transactions between KD Holdings and the bank's parent company that are part of public record. I can't establish a direct line from there to the trust without access I don't have." Zuri hung up and sat in the empty room with the particular feeling of someone watching a picture come into focus and not entirely wanting to see what it is. Then her phone rang. Not a number she recognized. She stared at it for 2 rings. She answered. "Ms. Bennett," a man's voice. Calm and controlled the way certain people were calm, not because nothing was wrong, but because control was so habitual it had become structural. "My name is Kang Do-hwan. I believe we met last Thursday." Her throat tightened slightly. She breathed through it. "I remember. I'd like to explain some things to you." A brief pause. "In person, if you're willing. There are things you deserve to hear from me directly, rather than from whatever you've been reading today." "How did you know I'd been reading anything today?" The silence was approximately 1 second long. "Because you're smart enough to have searched for my name after we met, and it didn't take 3 days to find what's in those documents. It took 3 days for you to decide what to do with it." She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside her. "That's a very specific characterization of my decision-making process." "I've been paying attention," he said. "I owe you an explanation for why." She thought about the lemon tree. She thought about sitting in the lobby after the settlement meeting with her hands shaking. Felt seen. She thought about everything she'd assembled in the last 3 weeks and the anonymous envelopes and the woman on the phone who believed her but couldn't help her enough and the enormous machine grinding steadily in her direction. Where, she said. He named a restaurant in Mapogu, small, private, not associated with anything attached to his name. Tomorrow at noon. She wrote the address on the inside of her wrist because she had no paper within reach. I'll be there, she said. She hung up and stood for a moment, with her back against the wall. She thought about what Min Ji-young had said. That's not a charitable impulse. That's a specific, intentional decision. The restaurant was small enough that she counted 7 tables on entering. 4 were occupied. He was at the back, already seated, with his back to the wall, and a clear sight line to the door, which was either a security habit or a statement about how he moved through the world or both. He stood when she approached. Not theatrical, just a reflex. The kind of thing men of a certain generations were raised toward without being told why. She sat across from him. The table between them was very small. Thank you for coming, he said. Start talking, she said, because she was tired and scared in a way that had been running at a low, continuous frequency for 3 weeks, and she didn't have the energy for social architecture anymore. Something moved across his face, not offense, more like recognition. 3 years ago, he said, a rain in the alley behind Yuljiro. You found a man you didn't know. You stayed. She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily. That was me. The air pressure in the room shifted slightly. She thought back to it, a November night. She'd been walking back from a late dinner meeting. The alley was a shortcut, and there had been a man on the ground, partially conscious, bleeding from somewhere she couldn't identify in the dark and the rain. She'd called the ambulance. She'd stayed. She'd ridden with him to the hospital. She'd paid the emergency deposit at the admissions desk, 300,000 won on her credit card, because the intake staff said they couldn't process him without it, and she couldn't find any identification on him, and she could not make herself leave. He'd been unconscious by the time they arrived. She'd given the hospital her contact number in case there was information about who he was, and then she'd gone home. No one had ever called. She'd thought about him occasionally in the months after. She'd never found out who he was. You were hurt badly, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. 3 broken ribs, punctured lung, significant blood loss. He said it the way people said things they'd had time to become factual about. The doctors told me if I'd been there another 20 minutes, the lung would have been the problem that ended things. She pressed her thumbnail into the side of her index finger. An old habit for moments when she needed something to anchor to. Why didn't anyone call me? I left my number. I asked them not to. Why? He looked at the table for a moment. In 3 years of occasionally reconstructing this conversation in her head, not often, but sometimes she had never imagined it starting like this. Because I knew who you were by then, he said, and I knew that if you found out who I was, it would either frighten you or create a situation you didn't choose. You did something good for a stranger in a dark alley. You didn't need to be tangled into my life as a consequence. So instead, you paid for my legal defense anonymously. She said it flat, not as a question. Yes, and sent me anonymous notes about Orexis. Pause. Yes, and had me monitored to know when to reach out. He didn't deny it. I've known broadly what your situation was since the settlement meeting. My people keep track of things that concern me. I concern you. Yes, he said it without dressing it up. You concerned me 3 years ago and I handled that badly, which is my responsibility. When the Wexlers started moving against you, I couldn't watch that without doing something. She sat back. She pressed her thumbnail into her finger again and then made herself stop. What do you want from me? She said. Nothing. You haven't already decided you want for yourself. She studied his face. He was controlled, the way infrastructure was controlled, not absence of pressure, but distribution of it. There was something behind his eyes that she'd caught a fragment of at the networking event and lost again, and she could see it more clearly now, something tired and wary and watching. A man who had spent a long time waiting for people to want something from him, and calibrating in advance. I'm going to ask you something directly, she said. And I need you to answer me directly. Yes, the things those documents say about you. The networks, the organized crime connections. Are they true? The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. Yes, he said. Not all of it accurately described, but substantially yes. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. Then I need to know exactly what you're offering and what it costs me, she said. Because I'm not going from one cage into another. Something shifted in him subtle, but she was watching closely enough to catch it. A straightening, not defensiveness. More like a man recognizing the shape of a sentence he hadn't expected. I can get you out of Korea safely, he said. Passport records, a clean departure before the criminal charges formally land. Or I can help you fight. My network has the reach to trace every payment the Wexlers made, every journalist they planted a story with, every political connection they used. I can map the entire operation and give you what you need to expose it. And the cost? There's no transaction, he said, and his voice was careful and clear. I owe you a debt I've been carrying for 3 years. Whatever you choose, consider it paid. She looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant was very quiet. Somewhere in the kitchen, something was simmering. I'm not leaving, she said. He nodded once, as if he'd already known. Then we start tomorrow, he said. She pushed her chair back slightly. We start tonight. I need you to tell me everything you know about Assemblyman Ryu Song-min. The name landed on the table like something with weight. His expression didn't change, but she watched his jaw tighten. Just slightly, just once. How much do you know? He said. Enough to know his name belongs next to the Orexis acquisition date, she said. Not enough to know why yet. He looked at her for a moment. Then he gestured to the server across the room. Then sit down properly, he said. This is going to take a while. For the next 6 hours, they sat at that small table in the back of the restaurant, while the staff quietly moved around them, and the city outside ran through its evening routines. And Kang Do-hwan told her the shape of what she had stumbled into, and Zuri Bennett began to understand, for the first time, exactly how dangerous her accidental knowledge had always been. Ryu Song-min was a 3-term National Assembly member from a constituency in South Chungcheong Province, publicly a moderate with clean infrastructure and an anti-corruption platform that had been good cover for 15 years. Do-hwan's intelligence team had been tracking a subset of his financial activity for 2 years in connection with an unrelated investigation and had accumulated documentation that placed Ryu at the center of a regulatory approval mechanism, a system, where pharmaceutical, industrial, and corporate transactions that required government clearance could be fast-tracked in exchange for structured payments moving through a chain of holding companies and offshore accounts. The Orexis deal was one of 11 transactions they had mapped in the past 5 years. But Orexis was the most exposed, because Orexis had a documentation trail that ran directly through the Wexler Group's acquisition process, and that trail had, for 3 confusing weeks in a misconfigured inbox, passed through Zuri's email address. He doesn't remember the specific documents, Do-hwan said. He was talking to her the way you talk to someone when you were used to briefing people and forgot you were talking to the subject of the briefing. She noticed this in the first hour and decided it was fine. It meant he was giving her real information instead of a managed version. My analysts confirmed. She flagged the routing error and was told to disregard it. But the documents existed in her inbox for a verifiable window of time. To anyone looking to protect the Orexis deal, that's an exposure. They don't actually know if I read them. No, but they can't afford to find out. And after the divorce, you became a variable. They decided they couldn't manage quietly. Zuri stared at the table. Marjorie didn't know about Orexis. That's not her style. She's not political, she's social. Correct, Do-hwan said. Marjorie's motivation was personal. The divorce humiliated her. But she was contacted before the settlement meeting. We have the communication log by someone operating on Ryu's behalf, who offered to help manage the situation in exchange for access to certain Wexler legal resources. They used her personal grudge as a delivery mechanism. They provided her with the tools. She provided the face. By the time the criminal case is officially filed, it will look like personal retaliation, not political suppression. Zuri pressed her fingers flat against the table. Choi Gyong-tae, she said. Ryu's brother-in-law, the prosecutor. Do-hwan looked at her with the specific expression of someone recalibrating upward. How did you get to him? I've been doing research for 3 weeks. His name appears in the regulatory timeline adjacent to Ryu's if you know where to look. When you told me Ryu tonight, I went back over the connection I'd already started building. She looked at him. He's the one building the criminal case against me. Yes. Something that might have been respect moved briefly across his face. Choi has the authority to direct the investigation, manufacture evidentiary documentation, and arrange for charges to be escalated through the system without normal review protocols. He's done it before. Smaller targets, less public exposure. How long before charges are formally announced? Do-hwan's expression shifted. Not much. A tightening around the eyes. We believe 10 to 14 days, he said. She absorbed that. Then we have 10 days, Zuri. He said her name for the first time, and the way he said it, not pulling on it, not adding weight for effect, just saying, it stopped her internal calculation for a moment. What we're building needs to be irrefutable, not a counter-narrative, not a press statement, something so documented that it survives every attempt to dismiss it as retaliation or fabrication. That requires time we may not have enough of. So we work faster, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The restaurant had emptied around them. The server had stopped checking on them an hour ago with the particular discretion of staff who understood when to be invisible. There's one more thing, he said. Something in his tone changed a fraction of register, barely perceptible. She caught it. Tell me. 3 days ago, my surveillance team recorded a private meeting. He reached into his jacket and removed a small device, set it on the table between them. Marjorie Wexler, Assemblyman Ryu, Prosecutor Choi. Together, he pressed play. The audio was clean. Whatever microphone his team had placed was high-end. She could hear the sound of ice in glasses, the low ambient sound of an expensive private room. She heard Marjorie's voice first, crisper on audio than in person, stripped of its visual performance. She heard Ryu's measured, almost gentle Korean. She heard Choi and the particular texture of a man laying out a plan with the confidence of someone who has done it before and not been stopped. She heard them discuss her name. She heard them discuss the documents they would fabricate. She heard the phrase in Choi's voice, careful and clipped manufacture the witnesses we need. She heard Marjorie say, just make sure she can't talk before anyone thinks to listen. Zuri sat with her hands flat on the table and let the audio run to its end. The device went quiet. The restaurant was silent. Her pulse was in her throat. She breathed through it. They're going to imprison me, she said. That's the plan. She looked at him. You have the recording. Yes. Then release it. If I release it now, their lawyers will spend 48 hours establishing that it's fabricated an AI deepfake, a planted audio, retaliation by a known organized crime figure attempting to obstruct a legitimate criminal investigation. They'll create enough doubt that it drowns before any official body has to address it. We'll have used our most powerful piece of evidence and lost it. She understood. She hated that she understood. So we wait. We prepare, he said. One strike, overwhelming, public, in a setting where there's no controlled narrative to hide behind. She looked at the device on the table between them. She thought about Marjorie's voice, saying make sure she can't talk. She thought about the lemon tree. She thought about the water stain. She thought about the 4-count breathing in the lobby of the Wexler building, and whether she'd known, standing on that sidewalk, that the worst wasn't over. She'd told herself she was done, being surprised by how bad things could get. Then her phone lit up on the table beside her. A news alert. A headline. Her name. She read it. Then she set the phone face down very slowly on the table. They moved, she said. The charges are public. Do-hwan looked at the phone. Something moved through his face, not surprise. Something more like a man, watching a calculation he'd made, confirmed. How long ago? He said. It wasn't entirely a question. 20 minutes. He was already reaching for his own phone. She make 2 calls in rapid succession. Short, in Korean, the specific compressed language of someone communicating contingencies they've already prepared for. He hung up the second call. "We need to move you tonight," he said.
Move me where?
"Somewhere they can't bring you in before we're ready." He stood. He was controlled, but there was something underneath it now, a current of something operational and very focused. "My building. The security there is." "I'm not going to your building," she said. He stopped. "I'm going with you," she said, "because I don't have another option right now, and I know that. But I need you to understand something." He waited. "This isn't you protecting me," she said. "This is us working towards something I chose. That distinction disappears at any point. I walk. Charges or not." He looked at her for a moment. "Understood," he said. She stood. She picked up her bag. She picked up the device he'd left on the table and held it out to him. He took it. They walked out of the restaurant into the cold night, and behind them, somewhere across the city, Zuri Bennett's name was running across screens, with the word fugitive attached to it for the first time. She did not look at her phone. She kept walking. The penthouse was on the 41st floor of a building in Gangnam that didn't advertise its address anywhere publicly visible. The lobby had no signage beyond a small brass plate with a property management company name that meant nothing to her. The security desk had 2 men who stood when Do-hwan entered and said nothing when he passed, which told her everything about the kind of place this was. The elevator required a keycard and a code. She noted both without meaning to. Old habit from a marriage where she'd learned to map her exits in advance. The penthouse itself was large in the way that function spaces were large, not performative, not decorated for impression. Clean lines, minimal furniture, the kind of deliberate emptiness that came from a person who spent most of their time thinking and needed the space around them to reflect that. Kitchen along one wall. A long window running the width of the room that turned the entire city into a painting nobody had commissioned. 2 doors she assumed were bedrooms. A central room that was half living space and half something else, a tantam table against the far wall, covered in organized stacks of documents, 2 monitors running, a whiteboard partially filled with Korean text, and lines connecting names she didn't recognize yet. She stood in the entrance and took it in. "Guest room is the left door," Do-hwan said behind her. "The bathroom has what you need. I can have someone bring clothes by morning." "I have a bag," she said. She was still holding it. She'd grabbed it from her room, on the way he'd waited downstairs with the engine running, while she climbed the stairs for the last time and pulled together everything that mattered into the same 2 bags. She'd left the Wexler residence with 6 weeks earlier. She'd looked at the room once before she closed the door. The sleeping bag on the floor, the single lamp, the chemical smell from the dry cleaner below. She hadn't felt sentimental about it. She'd felt tired in a very specific way, the kind of tired that lives behind the sternum and doesn't respond to sleep. Now she set her bag down near the left door and walked to the window. The city below was enormous and indifferent and lit up in 1,000 directions at once. Pressed her fingers against the glass. It was cold. 41 floors up, the traffic was soundless, just light moving in organized patterns. "I need to call Min Ji-young," she said. "Already done," said a voice she didn't recognize. She turned. A man she hadn't noticed was sitting at the table with the monitors. Late 30s, lean, with close-cropped hair, and the focused posture of someone who spent most of their life looking at screens. He hadn't stood when they entered, which meant he had a different relationship to Do-hwan than the men at the lobby desk. "This is Park Tae-suk," Do-hwan said. "He leads my intelligence operation." "You called my attorney," Zuri said to him directly. "I reached her 10 minutes ago," Park said. He had a precise, unhurried way of speaking that she immediately catalogued as either natural or very practiced. "She's aware of the charges and is filing emergency procedural challenges tonight. It buys time possibly 48 hours before they can formally execute the arrest warrant. 48 hours. Maybe 72 if the filing lands with a sympathetic clerk. After that, the warrant is executable, and her procedural options narrow significantly." Zuri turned back to the window. She breathed through the calculation. 72 hours. They'd talked at dinner about needing time they didn't have, and now the math had gotten worse. What do we have right now? She said, not eventually. Tonight, Do-hwan moved to the table. He and Park exchanged something in Korean brief, not a conversation, more like two people who shared a shorthand confirming a shared state of information. The recording, Do-hwan said. Financial traces on 4 of the 11 Orexis-related transactions. Journalist payment records on 2 of the smear campaign operators, enough to establish a pattern, but not a full map. The Wexler communications log that places Marjorie in contact with Ryu's intermediary before the settlement meeting. And the inbox routing documentation from your time in the communications department. The inbox documentation, she said, turning. How did you get that? We have a contact inside the Wexler Group's IT infrastructure, Park said. He didn't elaborate on what that meant. She decided not to ask. Is it verifiable? She said, independently. By someone with no connection to either of you. Park and Do-hwan looked at each other. The look lasted approximately 1 second. Currently no, Do-hwan said. She pressed her lips together. Then it's not usable yet. If everything we release can be traced back to your network, they neutralize it as criminal fabrication inside a news cycle. We need a chain of verification that doesn't run through you. That's what we've been building, Park said, and for the first time something shifted fractionally, in his voice not irritation, more like a man recalibrating his assessment of someone. The question is what's ready versus what needs more time. We have 72 hours, she said. Tell me what's ready. She didn't sleep until 4 in the morning. The guest room was clean and quiet, and the bed was actual furniture, which her body registered with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been on a sleeping bag for 2 weeks. But she lay on top of the covers in her clothes and worked through everything Park had walked her through across 2 hours. At the table, the documents spread between them. Do-hwan present, but mostly quiet, asking the occasional precise question and otherwise letting her and Park build the map together. She had a memory for patterns. She'd always had it. During the marriage, it had been useful for navigating the Wexler family's social architecture, tracking who was aligned with whom, which alliances shifted, and when, which smiles were structural, and which were genuine. She'd thought of it as an unfortunate skill, the kind of thing you developed when your environment required constant, careful reading. Now she was pointing it at a financial and political network, and the pattern it was returning to her was large enough that she had to keep breaking it into sections to hold it. Ryu's approval mechanism wasn't uniquely built for Orexis. Orexis was just the transaction where the documentation trail was most exposed. But Orexis was also the most recent, which meant the people protecting it were still actively protecting it. Choi's authority was live. Ryu's political position was intact. The Wexler's corporate immunity from government contract review was still in place. The entire structure was operational, which meant they weren't fighting something historical. They were fighting something that was still running. She stared at the ceiling at 3:48 in the morning and thought about that. Then she got up, went to the central room, and stood at the whiteboard. She found a marker. She started writing. She was still at the whiteboard when Do-hwan appeared in the doorway at 5:12. He was dressed, she wasn't sure if he'd slept or just changed clothes, and he carried 2 mugs of coffee, which meant he'd known she was awake, which meant someone or something in this apartment had registered her movement without her registering the monitoring. She filed that away without reacting to it. She took the coffee. He looked at the whiteboard. She watched his eyes move across what she'd added. He was quiet for a moment. You mapped the verification chain, he said. The problem isn't that we don't have the evidence, she said. Problem is provenance. Everything we have right now can be dismissed because of where it came from. So the question isn't how to get more evidence. The question is how to create a verification chain that's independent enough to survive scrutiny. She tapped a section of the whiteboard. These 3 financial documents, the payment records to the journalists. If we could get those in front of an independent forensic accountant before the arrest warrant executes. I have a contact, Do-hwan said. She's retired from the Financial Services Commission. She works independently now. If she reviews the documents and will go on record, she would be doing it at your request. That's the problem. She'd be doing it because the documents are real. His voice was level, but she heard something underneath it, a man who was accustomed to his resources being sufficient and was navigating the specific frustration of having resources that were, right now, the wrong shape for the problem. The authenticity of the documents doesn't change. It's based on who asked for the review. It does if Choi's legal team gets 15 minutes in front of a camera first. She turned to face him. I know how this works. Elliot's family managed public narrative for 20 years. I watched it up close. The first story wins, always. You establish the frame and everything after has to fight against it. He was quiet for a moment. Then we need someone the Wexlers can't touch, he said. Or someone they already tried to touch and failed, she said. Are there other people with exposure to the Orixis deal who aren't inside your network? Journalists who were approached and refused? Officials who were offered something and declined? Park's voice came from across the room. He'd appeared at some point in the last few minutes, without either of them registering it. There's one, he said, a former business reporter at a major news organization. She was handed the original smear story about you and refused to publish it. We have that documented. Zuri looked at him. Name? Song Ha-yoon. She's freelance now. She was pushed out of her organization 6 weeks ago, 2 weeks after she refused the story. The room was quiet. They punished her for not running it, Zuri said. We believe so. She turned back to the whiteboard. She found the marker. She wrote the name. Find out if she's willing to talk, she said. Over the next 31 hours, the apartment became a different kind of space. Park's monitors were running continuously, pulling real-time data on press activity, legal filings, and the movements of 3 separate surveillance targets: Ryu's office, Choi's office, and the Wexler Group's external communications team. Do-hwan was on and off his phone, moving through the apartment with the focused efficiency of someone managing multiple simultaneous operations who had learned not to let the management show on his face. Zuri worked. She slept in 4-hour intervals. She ate what was put in front of her. She held a video call with Min Ji-young that lasted 90 minutes and left her attorney-faced for the last 20 of them, which was the legal equivalent of someone pressing very hard on a poker face and managing it. The emergency procedural challenges were holding barely. Choi's team was countering through a mechanism that Min Ji-young described in the particular flat language she used when she was trying not to let her alarm translate into Zuri's alarm. It's a process argument, Min Ji-young said. They're claiming the procedural challenges are an obstruction attempt and petitioning to have the warrant executed on an expedited basis. The judge reviewing it is someone I don't have a read on. How long? If he rules against us, 12 hours from his ruling. If he rules for us, we're back to the original timeline. A pause. I wouldn't bank on the second outcome. Zuri hung up and told Do-hwan they might be at 12 hours instead of 72. He absorbed this without visible reaction. Then he said, Park. Song Ha-yoon. Park looked up from the monitors. She'll meet. Tonight if we need it. Tonight, Do-hwan said. Song Sa-yoon was 34 and looked like someone who had recently been through something similar to what Zuri was currently, in that specific quality of a person who had been forced to rebuild their professional foundation under conditions that were not of their choosing and had not quite finished deciding how they felt about it. She had a reporter's way of looking at things, taking in the room before sitting down, noting the exits, establishing where each person sat relative to what. She sat across from Zuri at a coffee shop in Mapo-gu. Do-hwan was not present. This was Zuri's call, and she'd made it alone, something that had required a conversation with Do-hwan that lasted 7 minutes and ended with him handing her a secure phone and saying nothing further. She appreciated the nothing further. Song Ha-yoon looked at her for a moment. You look better than the photos they've been running. Those photos are 3 years old, Zuri said. I know. I noticed that too, when they sent me the package. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The entire package was constructed. The sources were anonymous but consistent, in a way that real sources almost never. Our real sources contradict each other in small ways. They have agendas you can identify if you look. These all pointed in the same direction with no friction. And you refused to publish it. I told my editor it needed verification before I'd put my name on it. He disagreed. 2 weeks later, I was out. She said it without drama. I've been freelance since then. Less stable, but I get to decide what I verify before I publish it. Zuri put a folder on the table. I need to talk to you about Orixis Pharmaceuticals. Song Ha-yoon looked at the folder. She didn't reach for it yet. Before I open that, she said, I need to know who's behind this meeting. I am. Who brought you to me? Someone with a research capability I needed. He's not in this room, and his name doesn't go in your notes unless you independently verify his connection to the story, which is a separate story. Song Ha-yoon considered this for a moment. Is the person who brought you to me the same person those documents came from? Some of them, Zuri said. The inbox documentation came from inside the Wexler Group's IT infrastructure, which I can't independently verify the sourcing of. The financial traces came from his network. But the story those documents tell, I can walk you through my own first-hand account of what I saw in that inbox, what I flagged, what I was told to forget. That part is mine. That part I can give you on the record. Song Ha-yoon reached out and opened the folder. She read for 9 minutes. Zuri drank her coffee and waited. The acquisition date, Song Ha-yoon said finally. And the regulatory change date. 2 weeks, Zuri said. The window matters. The assemblyman's connection to the approval process. Song Ha-yoon's voice was careful, building something in real time. If I can independently verify even one transaction in the payment chain. There are 3 forensic accountants whose names are on the second page, Zuri said. I didn't pick them. I asked my attorney to identify independent financial forensic professionals with FSC credentials who have no documented association with the Wexler Group or KD Holdings. Those are her choices. Song Ha-yoon turned to the second page. She looked at the names. She looked up. You've been thinking about provenance. I've had time to think about very little else, Zuri said. They talked for another hour. When Song Ha-yoon left, she had the folder, the second folder Zuri had brought, but not immediately produced, and 2 hours of agreed work ahead of her. She would contact one of the forensic accountants independently. She would pull the public regulatory record herself and build her own timeline. She would not publish without calling Zuri first. Zuri walked out of the coffee shop into an evening that had turned cold and windy, the kind of cold that got under coat collars, and she called Do-hwan. It went well, she said. Good, he said. Come back. Something's developed. She did not like the way he said developed. Park was on his feet when she arrived. One of the monitors had a live document feed running something pulling from a legal database in real time, text scrolling. The judge ruled, Park said. 1 hour ago. She felt something drop in her chest. Against us. The expedited warrant is active. He said it cleanly, the way he said everything, but she could see tension in the line of his jaw that hadn't been there before. 12 hours. She stood in the middle of the room. 12 hours. She looked at the whiteboard. She looked at everything they'd assembled and everything that still wasn't ready, and the distance between the two. Song Ha-yoon needs at least 3 days, she said. Yes, Do-hwan said. We can't release what we have now. We've established that. Yes. And if they execute the warrant, they take me in, and once I'm inside their system, Choi controls the process. The room was quiet. There's another option, Do-hwan said. She looked at him. I move you out of their jurisdiction before the warrant executes, he said. Out of Seoul. Not out of the country, I know what you said. But somewhere they don't find you in 12 hours. That buys Song Ha-yoon her 3 days. She thought about that. She thought about everything that meant hiding actively, explicitly, while her name ran next to the word fugitive on every news ticker in the city. If they don't find me in 12 hours, they escalate, she said. They'll escalate regardless. There are people around me who could be used as leverage. Min Ji-young is covered, he said, legally and otherwise. She pressed her thumbnail into her finger. Old anchor. And you, if they tie this location to you. That concern exists already, he said. It's accounted for. She walked to the window. The city was the same city it had been 2 nights ago, enormous, lit, indifferent. She had stood at this window twice now, and Both times felt the particular sensation of a life she'd built replaced by a life that was being built around her by circumstances she hadn't chosen. She didn't like it. She turned around. 12 hours is enough time, she said. Not to go somewhere else. To accelerate what we have. Both Park and Do-hwan looked at her. The recording, she said. We can't release it cleanly yet, because we don't have the independent verification chain to protect it. But we're not trying to release it in isolation. We're trying to establish enough independently verified documentation that when the recording drops, it lands on ground that's already been prepared. She looked at Park. How much of the journalist payment chain can we hand to Song Ha-yoon right now? Not everything. The specific transactions that she can independently verify fastest. 2 of them, Park said after a moment. The amounts and the originating accounts match public financial disclosures that are already in the record. She'd need to connect them, but the raw data is already publicly accessible to anyone who knows where to look. Then we send her those 2 transactions tonight, Zuri said, with a note identifying exactly which public records she needs to find them in. She verifies them independently. That's 2 anchor points that didn't come from your network, that came from public records. A freelance journalist pulled herself. 3 days becomes 1 day, Do-hwan said slowly, working through it. Maybe, Zuri said, but it's something she can verify before the warrant executes. She watched him. She watched Park. She watched the 2 of them process this with the speed of people accustomed to making operational decisions quickly. Do it, Do-hwan said to Park. Park was already at his keyboard. She breathed. They were 3 hours into the new timeline, Park, building the document package for Song Ha-yoon, Do-hwan on a call she half listened to that seemed to involve the building's security arrangements. Zuri reviewing the whiteboard for the 7th time, looking for anything she'd missed when Park said something in Korean that brought Do-hwan's call to an immediate stop. She looked at Park's monitor. She couldn't read the Korean text that fast, but she could read Do-hwan's face, which had done something she hadn't seen it do before. A stillness that was different from his controlled stillness. Harder. Something underneath it that moved once, and then was contained. What? She said. Do-hwan looked at her. He looked at Park. Something passed between them. Tell me what, she said. Park turned in his chair. He looked at the floor for 1 second, which told her this was something he'd been hoping wouldn't be this conversation. The forensic accountant, he said. The list your attorney provided. Yes, the second name on the list, Yoon Chang-ho. I've never met him. My attorney identified him independently. He's worked for Ryu Song-min, Park said. Not recently. 7 years ago, 1 project. It's buried. It took our system flagging the name cross-referenced against our Ryu documentation to surface it. The room was very quiet. He's on my attorney's list, Zuri said slowly. Your attorney couldn't have known, Park said. It's not in any public disclosure. It was a private consulting arrangement that existed in a single internal record we only have because of a separate investigation. She thought about Min Ji-young pulling those names together. Min Ji-young, who was careful and thorough and who had spent weeks fighting for her. Min Ji-young, who had compiled that list from her own professional database because Zuri had specifically asked for names with no connection to Do-hwan or the Wexlers. If Song Ha-yoon approaches Yoon, she said, he reports it, Do-hwan said. To Ryu's people, or to Choi, or both. She pressed both hands flat on the table. Song Ha-yoon called him, she said. It wasn't a question. She already knew. She looked at Do-hwan. She called all 3 of them tonight. That's what reporters do. You don't have one source. You have multiple. She called all 3 to compare. Do-hwan's phone was already in his hand. He was calling. It rang 4 times, and she could hear that from where she stood. 4 rings, voicemail. Song Ha-yoon, she said. She's not answering. The calculation ran itself in her head with a terrible, automatic speed. If Song Ha-yoon had reached Yoon, if Yoon had immediately contacted Ryu's network, then as of some unknown point in the last 3 hours, Ryu's people knew that a journalist was actively building a story about the Orexis acquisition with documentation she hadn't sourced from press releases. And they knew who'd given her that documentation, which meant they knew Zuri was alive and operational and that the documentation existed. Which meant the 12-hour warrant window wasn't the threat anymore. They were going to move faster. Do-hwan was on another call. This one answered immediately, Korean moving fast and clipped. She watched his face while he spoke, and it told her what the words were before Park translated the summary in a low voice from the other side of the room. Song Ha-yoon's last digital signal had been a text sent 40 minutes ago. After that, nothing. Zuri sat down. She sat down because she needed to, because her legs made a decision her head hadn't caught up to. She sat in a chair she hadn't sat in before, and pressed her hands between her knees and looked at the floor. She had put Song Ha-yoon in front of a story, and Song Ha-yoon had called 3 sources, and one of them had been compromised, and now a woman who had already lost her job for refusing to run a fabricated story had gone silent 40 minutes ago. She thought about I get to decide what I verify before I publish it, said, with the particular quiet dignity of someone who had paid for that principle already and was willing to keep paying. She pressed her hands together harder. Is she safe? Her voice came out steady. She was not sure how. We're locating, Park said. Is she safe? She said again. Do-hwan crouched in front of her. He didn't touch her. He put himself at eye level and looked at her directly. We will find out, he said. Right now I need to know if there's anything else Song Ha-yoon had access to. Documents. Names. Anything she could have shared, or that could be traced back to a specific source. She went through it. She went through it fast and careful because Do-hwan needed the information, and falling apart was not something she had time for. She listed everything in the folders. She listed the names she'd mentioned. She listed the specific transactions she'd identified, and how. She didn't have the recording, Zuri said. I didn't give her the recording. Something, Do-hwan said. Is it enough? For a moment. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something in trolling something that lived in the same place as the thing she'd caught fragments of at the networking event, and across the restaurant table, the thing that was tired and wary and had been watching for a long time. I don't know yet, he said. She had spent 3 weeks being destroyed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. She had spent the last 31 hours building something that might have just been discovered. She had put a woman who was already paying a professional price for her integrity into the path of people who had demonstrated very clearly what they were willing to do to inconvenient people. She sat in the chair with her hands between her knees and the cold city running 41 floors below her, and the whiteboard full of her own handwriting behind her, and she understood, for the first time, with a clarity that was physical rather than intellectual, that being willing to fight was not the same as knowing how. She had been building this like a problem she could research and map and solve. It wasn't that. It was a war, and she was fighting it with the tools of someone who had never been to war, against people who had been here many times before. She raised her head. She looked at Do-hwan, still crouched in front of her at eye level. The recording, she said. Something moved in his face. Tell me how we use it, she said. Not the careful version. Not the version where everything is independently verified and provenance protected and nobody can dismiss it. Tell me what it looks like if we use it now. Worst case. He was quiet for 5 seconds. She counted. They call it fabricated, he said. Their attorneys spend 48 hours saturating every channel with reasonable doubt. Some officials believe it, others pretend to. The independent investigation that should follow gets bogged in procedural challenges. We get noise instead of accountability, and best case. If it lands somewhere public enough, somewhere the counter-narrative can't contain it. He stopped. Where is that, she said. He looked at her. She watched him think through something she couldn't fully read in his face. There's an event, he said. In 4 days. Seoul Grand Charity Gala. Political, corporate, media. Everyone who needs to hear this will be in the same room. Including Ryu, including Choi, including Elliot and Marjorie. She absorbed that. They're all in one room in 4 days. Yes, and the warrant executes in 12 hours. Yes, so we have to survive 4 days, she said. Yes, he said. She breathed in, she breathed out. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 weeks ago, standing on a sidewalk outside the Wexler building, thinking the worst was probably over. She thought about what it had cost her to be that wrong. She was not going to be that wrong again. Then we figure out what we do in the next 12 hours, she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out without a crack in it. Do-hwan looked at her for another moment. Then he stood up. Park, he said. Full lockdown protocol. Already running, Park said from across the room. And somewhere in the city below, a warrant was active and a journalist was not answering her phone, and 4 days was the only number that mattered now. Song Ha-yoon was found at 11:47 that night. Not harmed. That was the first thing Park said. And Zuri registered the specific quality of relief that ran through her at those two words, not harmed. A relief that was immediately followed by the understanding that not harmed was a deliberately narrow descriptor, and she should find out exactly what it covered. She'd been detained. Not officially, nothing with badges or paperwork or anything that created a record. 2 men outside her apartment building. A car. A conversation she'd been strongly encouraged to have in a location of their choosing. She'd been held for 3 hours in what Park Contact described as a private facility in Seocho-gu, asked a series of questions about her source materials, her contacts, and what she intended to publish. She had said nothing. They released her at 11:15 with a phone that had been wiped and a very clear suggestion about her professional future. She walked to a convenience store 2 blocks from her apartment and used the store phone to call a number she'd apparently memorized in advance. Told Do-hwan's contact that Song Ha-yoon had prepared for the possibility of being separated from her devices and had done it the way a reporter who'd already been burned once, prepared quietly, practically, without broadcasting the preparation. She's asking if the source is still operational, Park said. Zuri was on her feet. Tell her. Yes, Park relayed. Pause. She says she's ready to proceed, but she needs a clean channel. They have her phone and her laptop. She lost everything she was carrying. Did she lose the documents I gave her? A pause while Park communicated. She photographed the key pages before she left the coffee shop. The photographs are on a cloud account they don't know about. Zuri felt something move through her chest that was not quite the same as hope, but was adjacent to it. Song Ha-yoon had sat across from her in that coffee shop and immediately photographed the documents as a preservation measure, which was either paranoia or professional instinct honed by the specific experience of watching important things disappear. It was the most useful thing that had happened in the last 4 hours. Get her a clean device, Zuri said to Do-hwan. He was already on it. They didn't sleep that night. None of them did, though at some point Park put his head down on the table and was out for 40 minutes, and woke up and went immediately back to his keyboard without acknowledging the gap. Do-hwan moved through the apartment in the focused, controlled way. He moved through everything, occasionally disappearing to make calls in his room that she could hear the low register of, but not the content. She worked at the whiteboard. She rebuilt the map from scratch, this time specifically for the gala. The gala was in 4 days. The warrant was active. 12 hours had passed, and the arrest team had come to her former address in Mapo-gu and found an empty room above a dry cleaner with a sleeping bag on the floor and a lemon tree she'd apparently left behind. Again, which meant they were now actively searching. She was a fugitive in the technical sense. She let herself sit with that for exactly the amount it took to understand it, and then she set it aside because the emotional weight of it was not something she could carry and still function. 4 days. The gala was a private annual charity event hosted by a consortium of corporate and political figures. Black tie, invitation only, approximately 400 guests, live streamed on a foundation's public channel, with usually somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 simultaneous viewers. 2,000 to 3,000 was not enough. How do we make it more? She said to Do-hwan at 3 in the morning. He looked up from his phone. More live stream viewers? If the exposure depends on the gala being public enough that the counter-narrative can't contain it, 2,000 viewers is containable. They kill the stream. They issue a statement. They control the morning news cycle. She looked at the whiteboard. We need more people watching in real time. Not after. Not through clipped footage. During, he was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that every major news organization in Seoul will have someone at that gala, she said. It's a 400-person event with the assemblyman and a senior prosecutor and the Wexler family. That's not a charity event. That's a political and corporate social infrastructure meeting. Reporters cover it as a social calendar item, not as news. She turned to face him. What if they knew in advance that it was news? He looked at her for 3 seconds. Song Ha-yoon, he said. Song Ha-yoon publishes something before the gala, she said. Not everything. Not the recording. Something specific and verifiable, the 2 transactions she can independently document. She publishes it as a business story, a regulatory question about the Orexis acquisition timeline. It doesn't name Ryu directly yet. It doesn't name Choi. It raises questions about the approval process, and reporters who read it will be at the gala that night looking for a story, looking for comment from people who will be standing in the same room I'm walking into, she said. The room was very quiet. You're using the gala as the second story, he said. Song Ha-yoon's piece is the setup. The gala is the confirmation. The gala is where everything lands at once, she said. The documents, the recording, my first-hand account. All of it dropping in a room that's already primed to receive it, because reporters have been thinking about the Orexis question for 36 hours. Do-hwan stood up. He walked to the whiteboard. He looked at it for a long moment. She watched him work through the angles, the contingencies, the pressure points. He did it in his head the way she did it on paper, which was a different process arriving at the same place. There's a risk, he said. There are many risks. If Song Ha-yoon's piece goes up, and Ryu or Choi identifies it as a precursor, they'll have 36 hours to prepare countermeasures for the gala. They'll prepare regardless, she said. They've been preparing since the warrant went active. The difference is whether the reporters in that room are already curious when I walk in. He looked at her. You're willing to walk into that room, he said. Yes, with the warrant active. Yes, he was quiet. She could see something moving in his face, not argument, not resistance. Something that was trying to find a way to be something other than what it was. Do-hwan, she said. Say what you're thinking. He looked at the whiteboard. Once you walk into that room, I can't control what happens. I can put people around you. I can have the recording ready to release the moment it's needed. I can make sure the screens in that ballroom are accessible. He paused. But if they move to arrest you before you can finish, then I'm arrested in front of 400 witnesses and a live stream, she said. And everything we release the moment that happens goes out on a foundation that Song Ha-yoon already built. That is not a good outcome. It's better than the alternative. He looked at her for a moment. She watched him breathe in through his nose and out slowly, the single visible concession he made to the weight of what they were building. All right, he said. She turned back to the whiteboard. 4 days, she said. Let's build every minute of it. The next 2 days were the most focused she had ever been in her life and also the most afraid, and she discovered those 2 things could coexist completely, running at parallel frequencies that didn't interfere with each other. Song Ha-yoon had a clean device by morning. She and Zuri spoke twice through encrypted channels. 60s slitting, constructing the published piece with the precision of people who understood that every word needed to be independently verifiable and every claim sourced to something that had no connection to Do-hwan's Naom's network. The 2 transactions were publicly traceable once you knew where to look and had the financial literacy to understand what you were looking at. Song Ha-yoon had both. The piece went up 36 hours before the gala. It was published through a mid-sized independent business journalism platform, not a major outlet. Song Ha-yoon's name on it. A careful, factual examination of the Orexis acquisition timeline and a series of questions about the regulatory approval process that were framed as journalistic inquiry rather than accusation. No named perpetrators, no allegations of criminal conduct. Just dates, amounts, and questions that a careful reader couldn't stop thinking about. By noon, it had been picked up by 2 major business publications. By 3 in the afternoon, someone from Assemblyman Ryu's office had issued a statement calling the story speculative, and without merit. A sound like green wood splitting, which was the single most useful thing they could have done because it attached Ryu's to the story before it would have gotten there on its own. By 6 in the evening, Zuri had received a message through the encrypted channel from Song Ha-yoon that reads simply, 6 journalists confirmed, attending the gala and asking about the acquisition. She put the phone face down on the table and pressed her knuckles against her mouth for a moment. Then she looked at Do-hwan across the room. It's working. He looked at her. Yes, he said. And his voice was careful and level and entirely controlled, but she was getting better at reading what was underneath his control, the thing that moved there when something mattered to him. She looked away first. That night she sat in the kitchen at midnight eating rice someone had left covered on the counter and thought about how she'd ended up here. Not circumstantially, she understood the circumstances. She meant the specific texture of it, sitting in the kitchen of a man she'd known for 2 weeks, 400 meters in the air above a city that was actively looking for her, rebuilding everything from nothing, while someone she'd met in an alley slept in the next room. She thought about the lemon tree again. She thought about her mother in Atlanta, who didn't know any of this, who sent voice messages 3 times a week, asking how things were going in a tone that said she knew things were not going well, but was giving Zuri the space to tell it in her own time. She was going to have to explain a lot of things soon. She finished the rice and put the bowl in the sink and went back to work. The day before the gala, Do-hwan's security team began moving logistics with the focused calm of people who had done operational work before and were not going to spend energy on visible tension. She watched them communicate with the particular compressed efficiency of a well-drilled unit and understood for the first time, concretely, what his organization actually was, not as an abstract fact she'd read in a document, but as a functioning reality. These people moved the way they moved because they'd been trained that way, and they'd been trained that way because Do-hwan had built something that required it. She sat with the complexity of that without trying to resolve it. At 2 in the afternoon, he came and sat across from her at the central table, for the first time 2 days without a phone in his hand or a document to look at, which was so different from his recent pattern that she noticed it immediately. "What?" she said. "Nothing immediate," he said. She waited. He looked at the whiteboard. "I want to tell you something before tomorrow," he said. "Not because it changes anything about the plan, but because I'd rather you know before we walk into that room." She set down her pen. "I've been watching your situation since before the settlement meeting," he said. "When Marjorie began the first moves against you, I already had people tracking the Wexler organization's communications because of a separate matter involving one of their subsidiaries. You appeared in that tracking because you were inside the divorce proceedings." "I know this," she said. "What I haven't told you is how far back the watching goes." He looked at the table. "I found out who you were within 48 hours of the hospital. 3 years ago, I ran a full background on you, your work history, your finances, your marriage." A pause. "Everything," she absorbed that. "You investigated me," she said. "Yes. 3 years ago. Yes." She pressed her hands flat on the table. She thought about what that meant, not the legality of it, not the abstract ethics of it, but the specific reality of a man she'd helped in an alley running a background check on her and then watching her for 3 years. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because tomorrow is going to be what it is, and after tomorrow either everything changes or nothing does, and I didn't want there to be anything I hadn't told you." He looked at her directly. "You have consistently made decisions based on incomplete information about me. The anonymous fund, the envelopes, the meeting you agreed to. I kept controlling the information you had access to because I told myself it was protective. It wasn't entirely protective. Some of it was self-serving." The room was quiet. "You were afraid I'd be frightened," she said. "Yes, initially." He didn't dress it up further. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought she felt it. She thought about the restaurant table, and I've been paying attention, and the specific quality of his stillness at the networking event that she'd read as a man who was used to rooms adjusting themselves around him. She thought about a rainy alley and a decision she'd made in 40 seconds without thinking. "I was frightened when I found out who you were," she said. "I was also frightened about the warrant and the charges. And Song Ha-yoon going silent. I've been frightened every day for 6 weeks. She held his gaze. "Fear is just information. What you do with it is the actual question." He looked at her with the expression she'd seen fragments of in the last 2 weeks, assembled now more completely, something that was tired and wary and had spent a long time expecting people to leave and was working out, in real time, what to do with someone who kept not leaving. He didn't say anything. She picked up her pen. "Tell me about the gala's ballroom setup," she said. "I need to know where the screens are." The night of the gala, she dressed in the bathroom of the penthouse in the one formal outfit she owned, a deep burgundy dress she'd bought 2 years ago for a corporate dinner and never worn again, which she'd been carrying in her second bag with the specific reasoning of someone who had packed it without being entirely conscious of why. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She looked tired. She hadn't slept more than 5 hours in 4 days, and she looked exactly like what that was. There were marks under her eyes and a tightness around her jaw that no amount of careful preparation could fully erase. She wasn't going to walk into that ballroom looking like the untouchable victim narrative they'd been constructing about her. She was going to walk in looking like someone who'd been through something real and kept moving anyway. That was fine. That was true. She'd work with what she had. Park appeared in the doorway he knocked at least, which she'd come to understand was the extent of his deference to social convention, and told her the car was ready. She picked up the small bag she'd prepared. Copies of key documents, duplicated and distributed, one set to Min Ji-young, one set to Song Ha-yoon, one set to a trusted contact Song Ha-yoon had identified at one of the major business publications. All three had instructions about when to release them. Not contingency plans, certainty plans. They were releasing this tonight regardless of what happened to Zuri Bennett in that ballroom. She walked out of the bathroom. Do-hwan was standing in the central room. He was in a black suit, no tie, the same deliberate plainness she'd noticed at the networking event, which she now understood as a man who had no need to signal his power through his clothing, because his power was legible through other means. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Ready?" he said. "Ask me again in 2 hours," she said. They went downstairs. The car moved through Seoul's evening traffic with the smooth directional certainty of a vehicle that knew exactly where it was going, and Zuri sat in the back seat and felt the particular quality of calm that sometimes descended just before something large and irreversible. Not peace, something more functional than that. The absence of the noise that had been running for 6 weeks replaced by a single clear signal. She looked at her hands in her lap. "The recording," she said. "Who has the release controls?" "Park," Do-hwan said. "And a secondary contact completely separate from my organization. If something happens to Park, the secondary triggers automatically when the documents are released. And the documents are already distributed. Min Ji-young has them. Song Ha-yoon has them. The backup publication contact has them." He looked at her. "Even if they arrest you in the first 5 minutes, everything releases. Then they've already lost," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever happens to me in that room," she said, "the information is already out of their reach. All tonight does is determine how public the collapse is." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have released everything without going in there." "I could have," she said, "but they'd spend 2 days managing it from a position of stability. In that room, they have no stable position. They're surrounded by witnesses. Their faces are on a live stream. There's nowhere to perform controlled damage management." She looked out the window. "I want to be there when they realize it's over. Not for revenge." She stopped. Thought about how to say the next part. "Because they tried to make me not exist. And I want them to have to look at me existing." The car stopped. The hotel entrance was lit up in the particular way of expensive private events' understated lighting, suggesting that everyone inside already knew they belonged there. 2 men in suits at the entrance who were not staff were tracking arrivals. She noted them. Do-hwan noted them. Nothing in his posture changed. He got out of the car first. She watched the entrance staff's faces perform a quick recalibration when they recognized him, that specific Seoul elite expression of people adjusting their behavior in the presence of someone whose power they can feel but don't entirely want to acknowledge. He walked around the car and opened her door. She took his hand to step out and let go of it immediately, which was part practical and partly a statement she made without planning it. They walked to the entrance together, Inside, the ballroom was exactly as she'd studied it from the floor plans Do-hwan had provided. The layout she'd memorized over 3 days until she could walk it in the dark. The screens she'd identified, the position of the live stream camera rigs, the table arrangements that put the top political and corporate guests in the central cluster. She was inside for 40 seconds before Marjorie Wexler saw her. She watched it happen across the room, the particular mechanical quality of a face receiving information that doesn't compute. Marjorie's expression didn't collapse. She was too controlled for that, too experienced in the architecture of public performance. But something behind her eyes did, something Zuri had never seen before, a kind of rapid interior recalculation that was visible for exactly 2 seconds before the control reasserted itself. Marjorie reached for her husband's arm, not Elliot's. The senior Wexler, the patriarch, who had been absent from most of this because Marjorie had insulated him from it and said something against his ear without moving her lips very much. Elliot was at a table with 3 people Zuri recognized from corporate events. He saw her when he looked up, and his face did something simpler than his mother's. It went blank, then pale, then blank again, in the specific sequence of a man encountering something he'd been told couldn't happen. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away. Across the room, Assemblyman Ryu Seong-min was standing with 2 other officials near the bar, and she could not see the specific moment he registered her presence, but she could see its aftermath, a stillness that moved through his body like a current, and a very quick private exchange with the man beside him that produced an immediate departure from the bar, the man's part. Ryu looking for Choi. She scanned. Found Choi on the opposite side of the room. Already moving, someone had gotten to him before Ryu's messenger arrived, which meant they had their own watchers in the room tracking the entrance. They all knew she was here. They were already moving. 10 minutes, she said quietly. 12 at most before they coordinate. 8, Do-hwan said beside her. He was looking at a different quadrant of the room. Choi already has someone on a phone, she breathed. Then I need to get to the front. She began moving through the room, and she was aware, very specifically, of the effect of her movement on the social architecture around her. The ripple of recognition, the quick whispered conversations, the phones that came out, and the cameras that turned. A sound because she had been the most discussed name in Seoul's elite social networks for 6 weeks, and she was now physically present in the room that was most densely populated with the people who'd been discussing her. She heard her name 3 times in the first 40 seconds. She didn't stop walking. There was a small stage at the front of the ballroom, elevated 6 inches, with a podium and a microphone that was currently off. The gala's official program wasn't scheduled to begin for another 30 minutes. She had not been invited to speak. She had not been invited to be in this room at all. She was almost to the stage when the first security figure stepped into her path. He was polite. He was large. He put himself between her and the stage, the specific positioning of someone trained to create obstacles without initiating contact. She stopped in front of him. She was aware of the room watching. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to return to." "I'm not going to," she said. A second figure materialized to her left. Somewhere behind her, she heard the controlled, compressed movement of Do-hwan's people. She didn't look, because looking would break her forward momentum, and forward momentum was currently everything. "Ma'am, there's an active legal situation that requires." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." She heard Marjorie's voice cut across the room, not loud, but with the carrying precision of a woman who'd spent 71 years ensuring her voice could reach the people she aimed it at. "Someone please remove her." The room went very quiet. Not completely. There was still ambient sound glasses, movement, the low hum of the live stream equipment that someone on Park's network had confirmed was currently active, with an audience that had been growing since Song Ha-yoon's piece had circulated to the 6 journalists who had talked to their networks, who talked to their viewers, who had begun watching the Foundation's channel in increasing numbers over the last 2 hours. Not 2,000 viewers. Something considerably larger than that. Park had sent her a single number 40 minutes ago, riding in the car. She'd looked at it. She'd put the phone down. She'd looked out the window at Seoul, moving past, and thought, enough. Now she looked at the security figure in front of her. "I would like to speak," she said, I'm asking for 2 minutes. "If what I have to say is without merit, you'll know it in 2 minutes and I'll leave." The figure looked past her to someone she couldn't see. She heard footsteps healed, deliberate Marjorie's particular cadence, crossing the polished floor. She turned. Marjorie stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, the control she'd observed from across the room was more granular. There was something operating very hard underneath that surface, a machine running at high capacity, and Zuri could see the specific places where the effort was showing. The set of her jaw, the hands that were still but too still. "This is a private event," Marjorie said. "I know," Zuri said.
"You have no business being here."
"I have nothing but business being here," Zuri said. Marjorie's voice dropped, pulling the words inward and sharpening them. "You walked away from everything this family offered you. You are a woman facing serious criminal charges who has run from the law, and you are standing in a room full of witnesses who will see you for exactly what you are." "Good," Zuri said. "That's exactly what I need." She turned back to the stage. She walked around the security figure who had made a decision in the last 10 seconds not to physically detain her in a room full of cameras, a decision that told her everything about what he was actually afraid of. She stepped up onto the stage. The microphone was off. She looked at it. "Can someone turn this on?" she said, loudly enough that her voice carried without it. From somewhere near the AV station at the side of the room, a technician looked at a supervisor. The supervisor looked at the live stream operator. The live stream operator made a decision that was either professional instinct or human curiosity, or both. The microphone clicked on. She looked out at the room. 400 people, every tier of Seoul's political, corporate, and media establishment. Cameras. A live stream running to a number she'd seen 40 minutes ago that had not stopped growing. Somewhere in the room, Prosecutor Choi had a phone to his ear. Somewheres Elliot Wexler was looking at her, with the face of a man watching something he can't stop. Somewhere, Marjorie Wexler was calculating the fastest available damage management protocol. Zuri put her hands at her sides. She breathed in through her nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. She breathed out. She did not shake. "My name is Zuri Bennett," she said, and her voice went out across the room and into the microphone and beyond it. 6 weeks ago, I refused a divorce settlement. That decision has cost me my job, my home, my professional reputation, and nearly my freedom. The room was very quiet now, the quiet of 400 people choosing to listen. "Tonight I'm going to explain why," she said. She nodded once, very small, in the direction of the side wall where she knew Do-hwan's people had access to the ballroom's screen system. The screens came alive. Dates, numbers, documents. Government approval records. Financial transfers. A timeline built by Song Hae-yoon and verified independently and published and republished, anchored to public record, impossible to dismiss as fabrication. She heard a sound from somewhere near the bar, a sharp intake of breath, collective, from people whose professional world was represented in those numbers. She spoke for 8 minutes. She spoke carefully, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every sentence and checked every claim, and knew that every word could be contested, and had made sure that contesting them would require demonstrating that the public record was false. She was halfway through when she saw Choi begin moving toward the stage. He had 2 men with him. She kept talking. Do-hwan stepped into the space between Choi and the stage so smoothly and immediately that it was clear he'd been tracking Choi's position continuously since they'd walked in. He said nothing. He put himself in the path and stood there. Choi stopped. The 2 men stopped. The room watched. Kept talking. She finished the documents. She looked at the room. "There's one more thing," she said. She looked at Do-hwan across the room. He held her gaze. She nodded. The recording began to play. The ballroom's audio system, engineered for orchestral events, carried every word of it with absolute clarity into every corner of the room. Marjorie's voice, Ryu's voice, Choi's voice, the sound of ice and glasses, and the low ambient hum of an expensive private space, and 3 people methodically planning to imprison a woman for crimes she hadn't committed. "Manufacture the witnesses we need. Make sure she can't talk before anyone thinks to listen. The recording ran to its end. The room was silent. Then it wasn't. The simultaneous activation of 400 phones, cameras, messaging apps, social sharing functions produced a sound she'd never heard before and would not forget, the collective digital response of a room full of people deciding at exactly the same moment that they were witnessing something they needed to document and distribute. She looked at Marjorie Wexler. Marjorie was standing 20 feet from the stage, and she looked for the first time in the 6 weeks Zuri had been watching her look at various things, like a woman who had made a miscalculation she could not correct. "You said I'd leave with nothing," Zuri said into the microphone. She didn't say it loudly. She didn't need to. "You were right," she said. "I left with nothing, and here I am." Marjorie took one step forward. Her face had reorganized itself into the attack posture Zuri recognized from 5 years of watching it deploy against anything that threatened the family's architecture. "You married my son for what this family? He was cheating on me," Zuri said. For 2 years, the breath in the room shifted. I didn't say it in the settlement because it wasn't relevant to what I wanted, which was out. I'm saying it now because you've spent 6 weeks constructing a story about me that depends on me being a calculating woman who married for money. So the room should know that the man you spent 6 weeks positioning as the betrayed husband had been maintaining a relationship with someone else since the 2nd year of our marriage. She paused. That someone is in this room tonight. The specific quality of silence that followed was unlike anything she'd planned for. She hadn't planned for it. She'd known the fact. She hadn't intended to use it. She'd included it because she was standing on a stage, in a room full of cameras with a warrant out for her arrest, and everything she'd built over 6 weeks hanging on the next 30 minutes. And she was done editing herself to protect who hadn't protected her. Somewhere in the room, a woman was hearing this for the first time. Somewhere in the room, Elliot was watching his carefully maintained version of events come apart from 3 directions at once. Somewhere in the room, Choi was still being blocked by a man who had not moved and did not intend to. Zuri looked out at the ballroom. She had been told she would leave with nothing. She had spent 6 weeks losing everything and building something from what was left. Now she stood on a stage in front of 400 witnesses and a live stream that Park had texted her the updated viewer count of 14 minutes ago, a number that meant this room was not the audience. This room was just the location, and the actual audience was sitting in front of screens, in places she couldn't see, and the story was already beyond anyone's ability to contain it. She opened her mouth to speak again, and then the side door of the ballroom opened, and 3 uniformed officers walked in, and behind them, walking not as an accompaniment but as someone who had arranged the accompaniment, was a face she recognized from photographs in the Wexler Group's internal directories, a face that had no business being in this room for any reason that made sense to her. Han Sung-jae, her former communications department supervisor. The man who had told her to forget the misconfigured inbox. The man who had left the Wexler Group a year after she had, whose departure she'd never thought about again because she'd had enough of her own problems. He was walking into this ballroom tonight with 3 uniformed officers behind him. And he was looking directly at Do-hwan. She saw Do-hwan's face change. In 3 weeks of watching his face, she had never seen it do what it did in that moment, a specific movement, rapid and controlled, but not fast enough. The expression of a man recognizing something he had not prepared for because he had not known it was possible. She had 1 second to process what she was seeing before. Park's voice came through the small earpiece she'd been wearing since the car, the channel they'd been using for operational communication throughout the evening. Zuri. Park's voice was stripped of its usual precision. Not panicked. Something worse, the voice of a man who was highly competent, was looking at something that exceeded the parameters of competence. Han Sung-jae he said a name she'd never heard. Then he said what it meant. She gripped the podium. The room was watching the uniformed officers move toward the stage. The room was watching Do-hwan. The room was watching her. She stood at the microphone with the specific sensation of a floor she'd been standing on, revealing itself to be something she'd completely misunderstood, and she understood in that moment with a clarity that was cold and total and allowed no softer interpretation, that the betrayal she hadn't seen coming hadn't come from Marjorie Wexler or Assemblyman Ryu or Prosecutor Choi. It had been inside their operation from the beginning. Park's voice, green, splitting. Park's voice was still gripping the podium, and the three officers were still moving through the room, and she had approximately 4 seconds before the situation resolved itself into something she could not reverse. She made herself breathe Han Sung-jae. The name Park had said. After it, she was working through it in real time, building the architecture of what it meant, while standing in front of 400 people who were watching her face information about whether to be afraid. Han Sung-jae was not a former communications supervisor who had wandered back into her life by coincidence. Park had said a second name, a name connected to Ryu Song-min's private financial network, a name that appeared in the documentation they'd been building for 3 weeks, attached to an account that moved money between Ryu's political operation and the holding companies that protected the Orexis approval. Han Sung-jae had been inside the Wexler Group's communications department for the same reason Zuri had been directed to forget the misconfigured inbox. He had been there to make sure no one remembered it. And now he was walking into this ballroom with 3 officers behind him, looking at Do-hwan with the specific expression of a man who had prepared for this moment and was confirming that his preparation was sufficient. He wasn't here for her. He was here for Do-hwan. She understood it in a single cold second. The warrant that had been active for 4 days was for her. But Han Sung-jae had spent the last 72 hours since Song Ha-yoon's piece went up, since Ryu's people had identified the operational origin of the documentation building a different case. Case that redirected the entire momentum of the evening. A case that said, the woman on that stage is being manipulated by a known organized crime figure who fabricated evidence to protect his own criminal network. If Do-hwan was arrested tonight, in this room, in front of 400 witnesses and a live stream, the story inverted. She became the instrument of a criminal enterprise. The recording became a fabrication. Everything she'd said in the last 12 minutes became the testimony of a woman who had been used. She let go of the podium. She stepped down from the stage before the officers reached it, which surprised them. She could see it in the adjustment of their formation. The half-second green splitting, the half-second recalibration of people who had planned for someone standing at a microphone and were now tracking someone moving toward the center of the room. Ms. Bennett, one of the officers senior, measured not unkind. I need to ask you. I know, she said. I'm not running. She looked across the room at Do-hwan. He was watching Han Sung-jae with an expression that had closed completely, not the controlled stillness she'd come to read over 3 weeks. Something different, harder. The expression of a man recognizing the specific shape of a betrayal and calculating its dimensions simultaneously. She crossed the room to him. The officer followed, but didn't stop her. Han Sung-jae, she said quietly when she reached him. Yes, Do-hwan said. His voice was very flat. How long? I'm determining that. Do-hwan. She put her hand on his arm, not holding it, just contact, just making him look at her instead of at Han. How long was he inside your operation? He looked at her. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully name, a kind of pain that was specific to the betrayal of something trusted rather than the loss of something strategic. At least 2 years, he said. She absorbed that. 2 years. Han Sung-jae had been feeding information from inside Do-hwan's intelligence network to Ryu's people for 2 years, which meant Ryu had known about the surveillance, had known about the documentation being built, had known, possibly, that Do-hwan was the source of Zuri's anonymous support, had known and had waited, had let them build their case and prepare their public strike and walk into this ballroom, and then had walked in behind them. She thought about the 12 hours after the warrant. She thought about Park's certainty about the timeline. She thought about the specific moments where their information had seemed slightly ahead of what it should have been. The judge's ruling that came faster than expected. The way Choi's team had known exactly how to counter Min Ji-young's procedural challenges. They had been reading the operation in real time. She looked at Han Sung-jae, who had stopped 15 feet away and was watching her with the careful distance of someone who had already done the thing he came to do and was now simply managing the aftermath. "You were in the communications department when I flagged the inbox," she said to him, loudly enough that the people immediately around them could hear. "You told me to forget it, to not mention it to anyone." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had prepared answers. "Miss Bennett, I think you're under significant stress, and you've been misled by people with their own. Were you working for Ryu Songmin when you told me that?" That's a serious. "Were you inside Kang Do-hwan's intelligence network for the past 2 years on Ryu's behalf?" The room around them had restructured itself, anyone explicitly doing it. The 400 people in the ballroom had reorganized into a loose circle of attention around this specific exchange. Phones up, cameras running, the live stream operator having made another decision about where to point the equipment. Han Sung-jae's prepared answer expression shifted fractionally. "I came here tonight," he said, and his voice was careful now, calibrating, "because there are people in this room who need to understand that the evidence being presented, minutes. The recording," she said. "Is it real? That's not something I can." "You were working for Ryu's network," she said. "You had access to Do-hwan's surveillance operation for 2 years. If the recording was fabricated, you would know. You would be the person who knew." She looked at him steadily. "Tell the room it's fabricated. Say it clearly on camera, right now. Tell everyone watching that the recording of Marjorie Wexler, Assemblyman Ryu Song-min, and Prosecutor Choi Gyong-tae planning to manufacture evidence against me is a fabrication." Han Sung-jae's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. In an ordinary context, 3 seconds was nothing. In a live-streamed ballroom with 400 witnesses and a question sitting in the air unanswered, 3 seconds was enough. She watched it move through the room, the shift of understanding, the recalibration, the specific social physics of a large group of people arriving simultaneously at an interpretation. Han Sung-jae said, "I'm not in a position to thank you," Zuri said. Turned away from him. The senior officer was directly behind her. She looked at him. "I'll come with you," she said. "I'm not going to fight the warrant, but I need 60 seconds first." He looked at her. He looked at the room. He was a man doing a professional job in a situation that had expanded significantly past its original parameters. And he made the decision that any reasonable person in his position would make the decision to let 60 seconds pass before it became the most visible part of his evening. 60 seconds, he said. She nodded. She walked back to the stage. She stepped back up. She went to the microphone. "I'm going to leave with these officers in a moment," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised again by how steady it was. "Before I do, I need to say one more thing." The room was completely silent. "Everything I've shown you tonight is in the public record or in documentation that Song Ha-yoon, a journalist, who lost her job for refusing to publish a fabricated story about me, has independently verified and will publish in full tonight. You don't need to take my word for any of it. You don't need to take anyone's word. The documents exist. The timeline exists. The recording exists, and no one in this room has told you it's false." She paused. Assemblyman Ryu, Prosecutor Choi Marjorie Wexler. She looked at each of them in turn. Ryu, who had gone very still near the bar. Choi, who was still blocked by Do-hwan's presence, and had stopped trying to advance. Marjorie, who was standing 20 feet from the stage, with the specific quality of a woman who had spent 71 years building something and was watching it come apart in a room she'd entered believing she controlled. "Whatever happens to me tonight, you are on that recording. The room has heard it. The live stream has carried it. That is permanent." She looked at Marjorie one more time. "You said I'd leave with nothing," she said. "I think we've established what nothing looks like." She stepped down from the stage. She walked to the officer and held out her wrists. He shook his head slightly. "Not necessary. Not here. Not with 400 cameras on them," and gestured instead toward the side exit. She walked beside him through the room. As she passed Do-hwan, she stopped for 1 second. "The backup release," she said quietly. "Already triggered," he said. His voice was controlled, but something in it was raw at the edges in a way she hadn't heard before. "Song Ha-yoon has everything. It's going up in the next 20 minutes. She nodded. She kept walking. She did not look back at the room. She did not look at Elliot. She did not look at Marjorie. She walked out of the ballroom and into the hotel corridor, and the door closed behind her, and the sound of 400 people talk simultaneously became a muffled roar that reduced to nothing as she moved further down the hall. She was arrested at 11:49 p.m. Processing took 4 hours. Min Ji-young was at the facility by midnight, which told Zuri she'd been watching the live stream and had prepared for this specific outcome before it happened, which was the most attorney thing Min Ji-young had ever done, and Zuri was profoundly grateful for it. The holding cell was cold, and the bench was the specific quality of uncomfortable that was designed to prevent sleep. She sat on it anyway, her back against the wall, and she let herself be very still for the first time in 4 days. She thought about the room behind her when she'd walked out. She thought about Han Sung-jae's 3 seconds of silence. She thought about what 2 years of a mole inside Do-hwan's operation meant for everything they'd built and everything they'd assumed was protected. She thought about Do-hwan's face when he'd said at least 2 years, specific kind of pain in it that she recognized because she'd seen a version of it in her own mind, finding out about Elliot's 2 years, the pain of learning that a thing you thought was solid had been hollow for longer than you knew. She pressed the back of her head against the wall. The overhead light in the cell was fluorescent and had a faint flicker that became hypnotic after a while. She watched it and breathed and waited. At 4:17 in the morning, Min Ji-young came to tell her the charges were being reviewed. At 6:50 a.m., she walked out. Not dismissed yet reviewed, which was the legal equivalent of the whole structure, being looked at by people who were no longer certain it should be standing. Song Ha-yoon's full publication had gone live at 11:58 p. 9 minutes after Zuri had walked out of the ballroom. It had been comprehensive and sourced and devastating, and it had landed on an audience that had been watching a live stream for 3 hours and was already oriented. The major news organizations had picked it up by 1 By 4 a.m., it was the lead story in 3 national publications. By 6 a.m., Assemblyman Ryu Song-min's office had issued a statement that contained the specific syntactic architecture of a man trying to create distance from his own recent actions, which experienced political observers recognized immediately as the first move of someone preparing to let other people take the weight. The structure was already failing before she walked out of the processing facility into a gray Seoul morning. Min Ji-young was waiting. She handed Zuri a cup of coffee without saying anything, which was the most precise social gesture she'd experienced in recent memory. Zuri took the coffee. She stood on the steps of the facility for a moment. "What's the legal landscape?" she said. "The criminal case against you is under review by an independent oversight body. I filed that petition 2 hours ago, and it was accepted, which means Choi cannot direct the investigation going forward. He's been asked to recuse, pending a review of his own conduct." Min Ji-young said it in the flat, efficient register she used when the news was good, and she didn't want to jinx it by performing emotion. "The recording is being evaluated by 2 independent audio forensic firms. Ryu's office is in Visible Crisis Management. Elliot Wexler's representation has contacted me to discuss a formal retraction of the defamation materials." Zuri looked at her. "Already. When the building is on fire, some people evacuate faster than others." A pause. "Marjorie Wexler's representation has not contacted me." "She won't," Zuri said. "Not first, not directly." She drank the coffee. It was gas station quality, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in 4 days. "What about Han Sung-jae? Currently being questioned," Min Ji-young said. "His connection to Ryu's network is being investigated. Given what Park's documentation showed and what his silence in that ballroom confirmed, I expect formal charges within the week." Zuri nodded. She stood there a little longer. "What do I do now?" she said, and she was aware that it was the first time she'd asked that question outward, instead of inward in 6 weeks, and that it felt different than she'd expected, not weak, not dependent, just real. The particular honesty of a person who has been self-sufficient out of necessity for so long that admitting uncertainty feels like putting something down. Min Ji-young considered this with genuine seriousness. Go somewhere warm, she said. Sleep. I'll call you when I need you. She went back to the penthouse because she had nowhere else to go that morning, and because everything she owned was still there, and because she was tired in a way that went below her bones. Do-hwan was not in the central room when she arrived. Park was at his monitors. He looked up when she walked in, and she could see from his face that the night had been long for him too. There was something around his eyes that was rarely visible, a human tiredness beneath the operational surface. Han Sung-jae, she said. He's being held for questioning, Park said. The connection to Ryu's network is fully documented now. Once we knew who to look for, the traces were there. He'd been careful, but not careful enough. He paused. He had access to my monitoring system for 8 months. Not the full operation, but enough to know what we were building and when. Was it enough to tell them about the gala plan in advance? Yes, but not enough to stop it. He looked at her steadily. They knew you were coming. They didn't have a way to prevent it without creating exactly the kind of scene that would confirm everything you were about to say. She sat down at the table. She was still in the burgundy dress. She'd been in it for 12 hours. Where is he? She said. Park didn't answer immediately. She understood that to mean Do-hwan was somewhere in the apartment, dealing with something that had been unfolding in parallel to everything else. He's been on the phone since 3 a.m., Park said. There are people inside his organization who need to be addressed. When you have a mole for 2 years, he stopped. It's not a small thing. No, she said. It isn't. She stood up. She went to the kitchen. She found bread and put 2 pieces in the toaster and stood watching them because she needed something to look at that wasn't a screen or a document or a face performing composure. She heard Do-hwan's door open. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her. He looked like what he was, a man who had not slept and had spent the last 6 hours dealing with the specific devastation of a trusted betrayal, which was different from other kinds of devastation because it required not just repair of what was broken, but reconstruction of everything you thought you knew. She looked at him. He looked at her. You're out, he said. Charges under review, she said. The building is coming down. He nodded. He moved to the counter and stood beside her. Not close, the particular careful distance of the last 3 weeks maintained, still, and she thought about how much of his behavior toward her had been calibrated for her comfort, her autonomy, her stated terms, and how consistent that calibration had been even under pressure. The toast popped. She handed him a piece. He took it. They stood in the kitchen eating toast, in the early morning light coming through the window, and she thought about the restaurant 2 weeks ago, the small table, 2 choices, leave or fight, and how much had happened in the distance between that night and this one. Han Sung-jae, she said. I've known him for 11 years, Do-hwan said. He said it without visible emotion, which was itself a kind of emotion. He came to me when he left the Wexler group. I brought him in. I trusted his read on people. A pause. He was good at his job. That's the part that stays with you, not that someone was incompetent enough to be turned, but that someone capable enough to be trusted was turned instead. She thought about Elliot cheating for 2 years with a competent, sustained deception that required daily maintenance. She thought about the specific anatomy of long-term betrayal, the effort it required, the choices it renewed every day. He was afraid of something, she said. People don't do that for 2 years unless they're afraid of something. Do-hwan looked at her. That doesn't change what he did, she said. No, he agreed. But it's worth knowing what they had on him, because it tells you about the pressure Ryu applies and how far it reaches. She looked at the window. For the investigation, he was quiet for a moment. You're still building it, he said. I'm always building it, she said. It's what I do. He looked at her with the expression that she'd been accumulating fragments of across 3 weeks, assembled now in the morning light into something she could read fully, the tired, wary, watching thing, the man who had spent a long time expecting people to want something from him or leave, encountering someone who kept doing neither and working out what that meant. She let him look. Then she said, "What happens to your operation, now that you know what was compromised?" "It needs to be rebuilt," he said. which means dismantling what I can't verify and starting again. Some of it's legitimate business that's straightforwardly legal. Some of it, he stopped, some of it is not something that can be rebuilt and remain what it was. Turned to face him. Are you saying that because you think it's what I need to hear? I'm saying it because the mole is the punctuation on something I've been thinking about for longer than 3 weeks, he said. Han Sung-jae was possible because of what my organization is. The opacity of it. The way people are held by fear and financial interest rather than by anything more durable. You spend long enough building something on those foundations, and you produce the conditions for exactly what happened last night. She studied his face. That's a significant thing to acknowledge, she said. I've had 6 hours, he said. She looked at the window again. The city was waking up below in its ordinary patterns, entirely unaware that it looked the same as it had yesterday morning, despite being, in several structural ways, different. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your life, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. And I'm not standing here making this a condition of anything. I know that too, he said. She stopped. She turned the coffee mug in her hands. I've spent 6 weeks watching what people do when they think no one's looking. I've watched what happens to regular people who wander in the edges of that and can't get out. She set the mug down. I don't want to be inside something that does that. I can't be inside something that does that. Yes, he said. Yes, you understand. Or yes. Yes, he said again. And his voice was quiet and clear and had none of the careful modulation she'd come to associate with him managing what he revealed. Yes to all of it, she breathed. She nodded once. She picked up the coffee mug and went back to the central room. Because there was still work to do, and she needed to not be standing that close to him in a kitchen in the early morning, before she'd slept or known what the next week looked like, or had any idea what the next conversation on the other side of all of this would actually sound like when the crisis wasn't holding it in shape. The weeks that followed were not clean. She had expected that. She had stopped expecting clean things somewhere around the 3rd envelope under her door, and she hadn't gone back. The formal charges against her were suspended at the end of the 1st week pending investigation of Prosecutor Choi's conduct. Assaulting. The Independent Review Board's preliminary findings, which Min Ji-young obtained through a contact and summarized in a 40-minute phone call that Zuri listened to while sitting on the kitchen floor of a temporary apartment in Seodaemun-gu, the one Min Ji-young had helped her find with money from the trust that was now formally identified as originating from KD Holdings. A fact that was no longer a secret confirmed that the evidence used to build the criminal case had been substantially fabricated. The fabrication trail led back to Choi, and Choi's trail led back to Ryu, and Ryu's trail led to 11 transactions and 15 years of regulatory manipulation and a financial network that the investigators described in language that appeared in 3 major publications within 48 hours of the finding as systematic and deliberately concealed. Assemblyman Ryu resigned on a Thursday morning at 10 a.m. in a statement that contained no admission of wrongdoing and the specific careful language of a man who had been advised by very expensive counsel. The resignation generated 4 hours of news coverage, then was consumed by the follow-up investigation, which was the actual story, and kept developing for months. Choi was formally suspended from prosecutorial duties 6 days after the gala. He was charged eventually with abuse of authority, conspiracy, and evidence fabrication, the exact charges that Zuri had heard his own voice describe planning to manufacture against her, playing through the ballroom sound system on a live stream that by that point had been watched by approximately 140,000 people. She knew that number because Song Ha-yoon told her. Song Ha-yoon's full publication had won a journalism award by the time the criminal cases formally opened. She had accepted it with the particular composure of someone who had paid for her principles before and was no longer surprised that principles had a price. Zuri watched the award ceremony from her laptop in the Seodaemun apartment and felt something that was not quite pride, but occupied the same space, the particular feeling of watching someone you receive recognition they'd earned the hard way. She sent Song Ha-yoon a message afterward. 3 words. You didn't stop. Song Ha-yoon sent back 2. Neither did you. The Wexler Corporation lost 2 major government contracts within the month. Elliott was removed from executive leadership in a board decision that the Corporate Communications Department described as a strategic restructuring, which fooled no one and wasn't designed to. Marjorie's defamation retraction came through Min Ji-young's office on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the gala, in a letter that used very careful language and contained no direct apology and acknowledged only that certain representations had been based on incomplete information. Zuri read it twice. She put it in a folder she did not celebrate. She did not send a response. She moved on to the next thing, because the defamation retraction was not the end of anything. It was the formal acknowledgement of something that had already ended at 11:49 p.m. in a hotel ballroom. Her name was cleared formally in a public statement issued by the independent oversight body 6 weeks after the gala. Min Ji-young sent a message that read, "Done." Zuri was in a coffee shop in Mapo-gu when she got it, the same neighborhood she'd lived in above the dry cleaner, and she sat at the table with her coffee and her laptop and let herself be still for a minute. Just a minute. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. She had been contacted by 3 organizations in the weeks following the gala. 2 were media. One was a nonprofit and international advocacy group working with immigrants and workers' rights cases in Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. They had been watching the case and had a position open that required exactly the combination of skills she had: cultural navigation, institutional communication, a sound like greenwood splitting, the specific literacy of someone who understood how corporate and political structures worked because she'd operated inside them and had watched what they did to people who didn't. She took the nonprofit position. The media offers she turned down. Not because she didn't believe in the work, but because she understood, having spent 6 weeks being the story, that she didn't want to spend her career proximate to the machine that made stories. She wanted to be somewhere that helped the people who ended up inside those machines without choosing to. The work was hard and not well compensated, and it mattered, and she went to greenwood splitting, and she went to it every day in a way that felt different from the professional self she'd had during the marriage, less performed, more direct, less shaped around what the surrounding environment required of her. She rebuilt slowly and on purpose and not all at once. Called her mother. That conversation lasted 2 hours and covered 6 weeks of material that her mother had been waiting for with the specific patience of a woman who knew her daughter would talk when she was ready. Her mother cried at 2 points, once when Zuri described the sleeping bag on the floor, and once when Zuri described walking out of the ballroom with her hands at her sides. Zuri did not cry during the conversation. She cried after it, alone, sitting in the Seodaemon apartment with the lights off. And it was the first time she'd cried in 6 weeks because she hadn't been able to afford it, and now she could, and she did, and it helped in the way things help when you've been putting them off long enough. She rebuilt the professional network she'd lost, more carefully the second time, choosing people over connections, choosing meaning over access. She didn't go back to anything that looked like her life inside the Wexler marriage. She didn't want to. Do-hwan did not disappear. He also did not push. He existed at the distance she'd needed during the acute weeks of legal resolution, making himself available in the specific way of someone who has decided that availability without pressure is the form of respect the situation requires. Occasional messages, practical information, a brief call when the charges were formally suspended, his voice telling her in a few words what the legal development meant, then not extending the call. She appreciated the not extending. She needed to find out what she was when she wasn't in crisis, and she needed to do that without his presence reshaping the answer. She spent 6 weeks finding out. What she discovered was that she was still herself, the same person who had flagged an inbox error and been told to forget it, the same person who had knelt in a rain-soaked alley, the same person who had pushed a settlement check back across a conference table, with her hands shaking on the other side of the gesture. That person was intact. She'd been through something that had tried to erase her and had failed, and she was still recognizably herself on the other side of it, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerable. She called Do-hwan on a Sunday afternoon in February, 3 months after the gala. He answered on the second ring. I'd like to have dinner, she said. Not a strategy meeting, not anything operational. Pause. Yes, he said. I'll pick the restaurant, she said. All right. She picked a small place in Mapogu that she'd eaten at twice during the worst weeks of the case. Place that had good food and no associations with anything that mattered to anyone, and was not the kind of restaurant where people had private conversations about organized crime or pharmaceutical acquisitions. Place for ordinary people, having an ordinary dinner, which was what she wanted. She arrived first. She was sitting at a table near the window when he came in. He saw her immediately. He crossed the room without looking at the other tables, which was a habit she'd noticed. He always knew where she was in a room before he walked toward her, which was either surveillance instinct or something else, and she'd stopped trying to decide which. He sat across from her. He looked at her, in the way he looked at her when he wasn't managing it. You look better, he said. I slept, she said. It helped. He looked at the menu. She looked at hers. They ordered. The server left. The criminal operation, she said. Where are things? Substantially dismantled, he said. The legitimate businesses are being restructured under a proper compliance framework. Some of the network I've cut entirely too exposed, too complex to clean up. He looked at the table. I lost significant financial interest. Some relationships that were structurally important. He paused. It was harder than I expected to separate what was legitimate from what wasn't, after a long time building them together. I know, she said. He looked at her. Not an accusation. I know, she said again. The food arrived. They ate. She watched him, in the ordinary light of a neighborhood restaurant, without a whiteboard between them or a crisis running on Park's monitors or a warrant pending, and what she saw was a man eating dinner actually eating it. Not working through something, not managing the room for what she suspected might be one of the first times in a long time. He had good manners and ate without pretension and had ordered something simple, which she'd noticed before without remarking on it. Han Sung-jae, she said. He looked up. What did they have on him? He was quiet for a moment. His younger sister, he said. She'd been in contact with Ryu's people 3 years ago, in connection with a property dispute. They had documentation of the contact that could have been presented in a way that implicated her in regulatory fraud. It wasn't true, but the documentation was real enough to threaten. She absorbed that. A sister. 3 years of compromise for a sister who didn't know she was the price of it. Does she know? Zuri said. Not yet, she'll need to, Zuri said. When the case comes to trial, it'll come out. I know. He looked at his glass. I've thought about how to... He stopped. It's a difficult conversation. Yes, she said. She thought about her mother crying on the phone, about a sleeping bag on a floor. She thought about what it cost to tell the people who loved you how bad it had gotten, the specific weight of letting them carry the knowledge of how close things came. Tell her the truth, Zuri said. All of it. She'll be angry that he didn't come to her, but she'll understand why he thought he had to carry it alone. He looked at her. That's not a judgment, she said. People carry things alone because they love the person they're protecting. The carrying is wrong, but the love is real. He was quiet for a long moment. You're good at that, he said. At what? Holding two true things at once, he said, without requiring one of them to cancel the other. She looked at him across the table. The restaurant was quiet around them. Ordinary sound. Other people's conversations running at a comfortable distance. I've had practice, she said. They walked after dinner, through the Mapogu streets that she knew by now, the uneven tiles near the old building, the dry cleaner on the ground floor that still exhaled its particular chemical smell into the cold air. Corner where she'd stood 6 weeks after the settlement meeting, trying to remember what came next. She stopped in front of the building. He stopped beside her. I lived here, she said. I know, the room on the 4th floor. Above the dry cleaner. She looked up at the lit window, someone else up there now. A different life running in the same space. I used to lie on the floor and stare at Otterstein and think about what I'd done wrong. And now? She thought about it honestly, the way she was trying to do most things now. I think I didn't do anything wrong, she said. I flagged a routing error and was told to forget it. I helped a stranger in an alley. I refused a settlement I found insulting. None of those things were wrong. She looked at the lit window. The things that happened after weren't a consequence of my mistakes. They were a consequence of other people's fear. He was quiet. That took 6 weeks to get to, she said. It's not a small distinction. No, he said. It isn't. They walked further. The city moved around them at its ordinary pace, indifferent and alive. The way cities were enormous enough to contain everything that had happened inside it, without registering any of it as exceptional. She thought about a rainy night. She thought about the specific decision she'd made in 40 seconds: kneel down, check the pulse, call the ambulance, stay, and how that decision had produced, through a chain she couldn't have predicted, everything that came after. The 3 years and the envelopes and the restaurant table, and the gala and the burgundy dress and the morning toast in a kitchen, and the 6 weeks of finding herself still intact. She thought about how strange it was that the decision she'd made in her least self-conscious moment, not strategic, not calculating, not even particularly thoughtful, just a reflex of basic human attention, had been the one that changed everything. I want to tell you something, Do-hwan said. She looked at him. I'm not going to frame it as what I want, he said. I've spent a long time framing things in terms of what I want and what I'm building toward, and I'm trying to do that less. He looked at the street ahead of them. I'm going to say what's true, and then it belongs to you to do whatever you decide with it. She waited. I have thought about you since the night in the alley, he said. Not occasionally, consistently. I told myself it was gratitude, and I watched you from a distance and told myself the distance was protective. And both of those things were partially true, and both of them were also a way of not having to find out whether what I actually felt was something I could manage. He paused. I can't manage it. I haven't been able to manage it since you pushed that settlement check across the table and walked out, which I watched on my surveillance feed at 7 in the morning and thought, there she goes. And then the Wexlers moved, and I could not watch that and do nothing. She kept walking. He walked beside her. That's the truth, he said. Unmanaged and without a strategy attached to it. She was quiet for a while. They walked a full block in silence. She watched her breath cloud the fair fold and thought about the things she'd learned about herself in the last 6 weeks, what she could carry, sectinus, what she didn't need to, what she wanted a future to look like versus what she was willing to compromise into existence. She stopped walking. He stopped. She looked at him. I know, she said. I've known for a while. He looked at her. I don't know what it looks like, she said. A mafia boss turned legitimate businessman and a nonprofit worker. I don't have a map for that. Neither do I, he said. And I'm not going to perform certainty I don't have. I wouldn't believe you if you did, he said. She looked at him for another moment, at the angular face, and the scar she'd stopped trying to trace, and the eyes that had been watching something carefully in her direction, for what she now knew was 3 years. She thought about carrying 2 true things at once. Dinner again, she said. Next week. Still my choice of restaurant. Something moved through his face, controlled, but not fast enough for her not to see it. Yes, he said. She looked at the street ahead. She started walking again. He walked beside her, and the city ran its indifferent course around them. And the February cold was the kind of cold that got under coat collars and made people walk a little faster. And neither of them walked faster because they were not in a hurry and had, for the first time in a long time, something that looked like time. A year later, on a night in late November, when the first cold rain of the season was falling on Seoul, Do-hwan took her back to a specific alley behind Yulji-ro. She recognized it. She stood at the entrance to it and looked down its length, the same proportions, the same walls, the rain moving the same way along the concrete, and felt the strange double exposure of being in a place you remember from a moment that changed everything. He stood beside her. I have something to say, he said. She looked at him. He was not a man who performed things. She'd learned this in a year of ordinary dinners and museums and long walks through Seoul and 2 arguments she didn't want to smooth over, because arguing with someone and remaining was its own kind of intimacy, and the long process of watching a person choose, in small daily increments, to become less afraid of being known. He reached into his coat pocket. He held something in his closed hand for a moment, as though completing a thought, and then opened it. She looked at what was in his palm. She looked at his face. You saved my life twice, he said. The first time you kept me alive. The second time you gave me a reason to do something worth living for. He paused. I'm not going to tell you. This is the most important question I've ever asked, because I know you don't respond well to pressure. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I'm going to tell you that I have thought about you every day, for 4 years, and I am not interested in stopping. She looked at the ring. She looked at the alley behind him, the rain in it, the particular light of it. She thought about a woman who had knelt down in a dark place because someone needed help, and she was there. She thought about everything that had grown from that decision, the enormous, complicated, difficult, beautiful, consequential thing that a moment of uncalculated human attention had produced. She thought about what she wanted. She knew what she wanted. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at him. You picked the restaurant last time, she said. It was adequate. High praise, he said. Don't push it, she said. He laughed, actually laughed. The real one she'd heard maybe 12 times in a year and had learned to recognize, and the sound of it went out into the rainy alley, and she thought about Marjorie Wexler's promise and what nothing had turned into, and how wrong a person could be about another person's capacity for survival. They walked out of the alley together into the rain, and Seoul kept running around them. And the future was not mapped, and not clean, and not guaranteed, and it was entirely hers. She had refused a settlement and lost everything, and rebuilt from nothing, and walked into a ballroom on a warrant, and told the truth in a room full of people who had spent 6 weeks being told she was a lie. And she had won not neatly, not without cost, not in a way that erased anything, but completely. The Wexler campaign against her was finished and documented, and part of the public record. Corruption network was dismantled, and its principals prosecuted. Her name was in the world, attached to things she'd actually done, rather than things she'd been accused of. The work she went to every day mattered to real people in real circumstances. And she had chosen what came next. That was the part Marjorie Wexler hadn't understood. You couldn't take everything from someone and leave them with nothing. Sometimes you just took away everything that wasn't essential, and what was left turned out to be enough to build the whole world from.